Did we lose Commissioner Mosby again? Are you still there, Commissioner Mosby?
I'm I'm trying to get onto my iPad. I was able to get on my iPhone, but it's not satisfactory. So I'm going to drop off and try and get back in on my iPad. I kept getting dropped. So
Darn it.
so I can't say anything on this. I can just, it's like having a phone is all. So hold on here. I'm going to leave and try again.
No worries. We wanted it to work well for you. Good morning, Vice Chair.
Good morning. How's everyone doing this morning?
Well, it looks like we're all present and happy-faced. You know, it's Friday, so. So we'll give Commissioner Mosby just a minute here or two to get reconnected, and then we will get underway. And good morning, everyone. If you're just joining us, we're just, our Commissioner Mosby is having a little bit of technical difficulty, so we're just giving him a moment to resolve that, and then we'll be underway.
When are we going to meet in person again?
That's a really great question.
I realize the way that we come into these meetings, it doesn't give us the same space to check in and catch up before. And certainly the way that I come into the meetings in the 2 minutes after we start. So I miss that, and so I share that because I know it's been a long time.
Chair George and commissioners, we have had conversation, I think, with most of you about the possibility of an in-person. One thing I would be clear about for the public out there is if we were to do that, I think we would continue to provide an option for people to join in by phone or by Zoom or Teams or some such technology. So I think we are, generally the state is reopening its offices to the public on September 1. That does not mean that all state employees will be back then. So things are still a bit fluid, and we're all also just watching the health situation in terms of requirements from the CDC and others. I'm down in California right now, and I'll tell you, most of the local governments down here have reimposed mask requirements in indoor public spaces. So we've just got to continue to kind of play this by ear a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
We are going to make arrangements so that possibility at least exists in the event that you want to do it.
Yeah, and we'll follow up more after this meeting. Stephanie, do we know if we have Commissioner Mosby back?
Chair George, I have not seen Commissioner Mosby reconnect at this time.
Okay, well, we understand that he's working on that. Our first item today is an informational item. So why don't we go ahead and get underway, and we know that he'll join us just as soon as he can. So I'm going to call our meeting to order at 8:25 this morning. Stephanie does have us recording already. I want to welcome everybody back to the second day of this EQC meeting. We're so glad that you can join us. And we will take just a moment to note that for the record, as was the case yesterday, all commissioners have been present, as mentioned. Commissioner Mosby will be back shortly as he's having a little bit of technical difficulty, but he's already connected this morning, so we know that he's trying. And looking over the agenda, do we see any need to make any amendments to the agenda? We do always reserve the right to make minor changes if need be. Do we anticipate the need to do that today? I don't see anybody waving frantically, so we're going to roll with this agenda, and if we need to, we'll adjust. All right, let's get underway with the state of Oregon's environment.
Great. Good morning, Chair George and commissioners. For the record, this is Leah Feldon, the DEQ Deputy Director. Nice to see you all this morning. So I'm excited about this presentation for you this morning. And with me today for the presentation of the state of Oregon's environment are our media administrators and managers. So I just want to say who that is specifically. Lori Pillsbury is our DEQ Laboratory Division Administrator. Lydia Emer is our Land Quality Division Administrator. Ali Mirzakhalili is our Air Quality Division Administrator. Justin Green is our Water Quality Division Administrator. And Colin McConaughey is our Manager of Office of Climate Protection and Greenhouse Gas. So after a few introductory remarks and just 2 short slides by me, I'm going to hand it over to them to take you through a look at each program. We brought last year's State of the Environment to you at your September meeting. And we also do a longer version of this presentation internally with that all staff are welcome to join and listen in on. And actually we have many of our staff within these programs that actually do the presentation when we're doing it internally. So staff have an opportunity to showcase their work as well. For today, we've shortened the content a bit to focus on some priority measures that our administrators want the commission to hear about that are important to the program and or maybe particularly germane to events of the last year. And so you'll hear a little bit about that as we go through today. The purpose of assessing the state of the environment is to ensure that we measure not only the agency's outputs, such as permits and compliance and enforcement inspections, right? But also outcomes. In other words, what benefits are we obtaining in our environment from the work that we do? And it's critical that we monitor trends in the health of our environment to assess the progress of our programs and be able to appropriately direct resources to achieve the greatest environmental gains where they are needed the most. It's also critical that we be aware of changes in the environment so that we can shift strategies and tell the story that science and data are illustrating for us about Oregon's environment. Stephanie, next slide, please. So today, we're going to show you a little bit about our measures. And so this is just to give you a high level understanding of where do these measures come from. And of course, we're not the only agency responsible for the health of Oregon's environment, and it takes partnerships to achieve outcomes in our land, air, water, and public health. But for DEQ's part, we use several measures to assess outputs and outcomes of our work. So the first that is illustrated on the left there are the State of Oregon Key Performance Measures. And these are reported to the legislature. And they're intended to gauge the progress toward the agency goals and mission. And typically during budget deliberations every other year in long session, the legislature approves, disapproves, or updates each agency's measures and hears about how the agency is progressing with those measures. In the middle there, you see the ECOS illustrated measure. In this case, it happens to be brownfields that is illustrated here. And the Environmental Council of States is what ECOS stands for. It's a national nonprofit, nonpartisan association of the state environmental agency leaders. And ECOS is an organization that helps the environmental agencies and their leaders in their work, and helps to make connection with the federal government at times, and helps us to get the message of the states out there in terms of needs around protecting our state environments. And these measures are used by most states. And so some of our measures are these ECOS measures. On the right, you see the DEQ measures denoted by our DEQ quarterly measure review. So we have approximately 118 total measures, which is kind of a lot. More on that in just a second. But that does include the KPMs that we report to the legislature and the ECOS measures. And these have a roll-up system to a higher level of 53 measures. So we review these on a quarterly basis. Typically, when we're reviewing our measures internally, we're looking for things that are in the red or yellow. In other words, we're not in a good place with our measure. We're not meeting our goals, and determining why that is, whether a process improvement is needed, and what's going on there. And I just want to mention that I think you can expect to see some of our measures change over the next couple of years. And perhaps even we'll have less measures. And the reason for that is, as you know, we've begun a strategic planning process, which has been delayed, but will start up again in earnest in the fall. And we expect that this process is going to inform new agency measures that will be aligned with the strategic plan that comes out of that process, and enable us to measure against that plan. And if that means less measures that tell more of the story of our priorities, then we think that would be fine. So as we move into the specific measures for our programs, I think you're going to hear about the opportunities and challenges that the programs face in attaining environmental outcomes, and perhaps where we have gaps in measurement. So we hope that with today we instigate your thoughts about these opportunities, and start your meeting off today with inspiration for the work that we do to benefit the future of Oregon's environment. So with that, if there's no initial questions, if you're ready to dive right in, I'm going to turn it over to Lori Pillsbury, our laboratory administrator.
Welcome, Lori.
Thank you. Good morning, commissioners. Thank you, Leah. As Leah mentioned, my name is Lori Pillsbury, and I am the Laboratory and Environmental Assessment Division Administrator. It's a long title for our division because we do a wide variety of things. As you all know have visited the laboratory in Hillsborough, we cover a wide range of work, including air and water quality, field operations and sample collection, analytical chemistry, as well as data management, reporting, and public outreach. The next few slides, I'm going to cover some of the laboratory's core capabilities, touch on some of our new and changing activities that we have going on at the lab, and talk briefly about the data we collect and manage. Next slide, please, Stephanie. Thank you. And so as we begin to talk about measures, part of the laboratory's work is collecting water and air quality samples and data to feed the agency's core work, and that's a fundamental part of our mission at the laboratory. We collect status and trends data for both air and water, and these data you'll see later as they provide the basis for some of the key performance measures that are upcoming in the presentation in the media divisions. We also use this data as information in some of our core programs, such as permitting, TMDL development, assessment, and air work, and as well as many others. Another important part of our core work at the laboratory focuses on monitoring environmental conditions as they intersect with human health. Our statewide groundwater monitoring program is a good example of this on the water side, as we look at vulnerable areas across the state we work in these areas and reach out to homeowners to look for volunteers to sample their actual drinking water wells. And then in conjunction and consultation with the Oregon Health Authority, we provide the homeowners the data and results from these samples, as well as some interpretation and information. And we've talked about this program in the past, but it is a continuing program that highlights our intersection with human health and vulnerable communities. On the air side, we've been working to expand our sensor network across the state, which is our low-cost sensors that provide us the ability to measure PM 2.5 around the state in more and more locations. This near real-time data provides information through our Oregon Air app and our air quality index page. And it provides, the public near real-time access to air quality in the area that they are at. As we can expand this, we still have gaps in coverage around the state, but as we can expand more and more, that provides much better information, especially during this critical time of the year when we have wildfire smoke. Next slide, please. On this slide, I want to just touch on our collecting data for environmental outcomes as well. But we're all aware that the environment is changing. These long-term trending activities we've been collecting provide us, a look at the environment over time, but we also need to respond to the changing conditions that we are experiencing. And so the laboratory's work is responding to these, what are unfortunately are becoming new normal conditions. During the recent legislative session, which I believe you heard a summary of yesterday, the laboratory did receive some additional resources to expand our operations in 2 critical areas that I'll touch on. And here's just some photos that you can see from last year in Lake Billy Chinook and the Brownlee Reservoir of harmful algal blooms. So part of our expanded work that we received funding during this last legislative session is geared towards expanding monitoring and work in around harmful algal blooms. We received funding for an additional instrument, which can expand, as well as additional personnel to expand our capabilities and allow us to look at the occurrence of, I'll call them HABs for short, as it relates to recreational waters. We've so far focused mainly on the drinking water facilities, but this will give us additional capabilities that will allow us to actually sample more recreational reported HABs, which are important for human health and also ecological health. In addition to this, we continue to look at our qPCR work in conjunction with Oregon Health Authority and EPA. qPCR is a genetic method that is meant to be hopes to predict where algal blooms will actually produce the toxin. Not all algae produces toxins that are harmful, and the qPCR method allows us to look for the gene that produces the toxin. So this is meant to be a predictive method for where algal blooms are actually harmful. On the air quality side, we received funding through Senate Bill 762 to expand our work to address effects from wildfire. There are expansions in the air quality media division as well as the laboratory, but specifically at the laboratory, we will be expanding the sensor network that I spoke about earlier that monitors PM 2.5 around Oregon. We also received positions to focus on community science, which will become very important as OSHA promulgates rules around wildfire smoke and its impacts on employees and those working outside, as well as a meteorologist to work on forecasting. In addition, we received one-time IT resources that will help us shore up our existing air quality system so that we can be prepared for future wildfires. And I just want to point out on this slide a very telling photo here on the bottom right. I guess you can't see my cursor probably because I'm not the presenter. Those are 2 filters from one of our air quality sites. So they're 24-hour deployments. The one was 24 hours from in August. And then the second one when the air conditions were considered hazardous. And just visually, you can see the type of conditions we had in September of 2020 last year. Also briefly, I'll touch on as we are partnering with the Oregon Health Authority to bring a drinking water analysis method online for PFAS. These are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances You've probably heard them called the forever chemicals. They've been concerned in other parts of the country because of high production. We fortunately do not have those type of production facilities here like DuPont and 3M, but we are bringing online the drinking water analysis method to be able to evaluate the occurrence of PFAS around the state. And that's in conjunction with the Oregon Health Authority. Next slide, please, Stephanie. And so lastly, I'll just talk briefly about our data generation and management at the lab. As we move into the future of environmental work, real-time and continuous data are really at the heart of the demand of what people want to see collected and what we are moving to collecting. In water quality, we're expanding our collection of continuous data and being able to work with our sister agencies to collaborate and incorporate the data that they already collect continuously. On the air quality side, as I mentioned, with new resources, we're expanding the sensor network, which is near real-time data, as well as moving some of our filter-based sensors, which we have to go out and retrieve a filter. We're moving those to automated continuous samplers with an EPA project. And also to ensure the air quality index is readily available during all times of smoke events, we are moving that to a cloud-based system. So what that means basically is when we have high traffic or high smoke events, we won't see the air quality index system be unavailable as has happened last year. And this is just one way that we're shoring up our technology and, trying to make sure that our systems are in place to, have our information available when it's needed. And this is just a photo of the index from last year when we had the big smoke event when everyone wanted to see it. And so this way, this year it's available and will be continued into the future. And so that is my last slide. And I will now turn the presentation over to Lydia Emer from our Land Quality Division.
Vice Chair Barrasso.
Thank you. Thank you, Lori. It's just a question in terms of, I appreciate seeing this, and obviously I have a lot more familiarity given last summer around checking the air quality, this particular app. I just wonder, as there's the greater proliferation of, home residential air quality monitors, and I know that they certainly vary in terms of quality, and they're not. I understand sort of the level of rigor that comes with our sensors. Is there a place to? I actually, looking at that, I wonder where you felt there are gaps in terms of the resolution of our sensors, and where that trade-off exists between leaning and supporting folks that have purple air network sensors and all that. Do you get what I'm getting at? Like the trade-off between expanding our networks, which come at certainly a greater cost, versus supporting and informing sort of the information coming out of these more consumer air quality monitors.
Right, that's a very good question. Thank you, Chair Barrasso. And one of the expanded funding opportunities we received from the legislature is in fact a position to work with community science, which will help us to be able to work with folks who have those purple air sensors. On the purple air website now, there is a purple air website. They are providing a regional correction, which is important to allow folks to understand what their data means, because those sensors are, as you mentioned, slightly different, reporting slightly different results than we report. And so that work is underway with EPA as well to, make that correction more robust and get that information out there. So I think having that additional person at the lab to focus on community science work will be important into the future. And that is an important step as we move forward, because as you point out, putting our sensors out everywhere is not feasible given the cost, but having more sensors available so that we can feed that robust correction and be able to work with folks to understand their data will be helpful into the future.
Commissioner Mosby.
Yes, Lori, probably not too dissimilar from what Sam asked. Obviously, we've got 4 bordering states, and we share, especially on air quality, we share some information. Get Portland, Vancouver, you've got Ontario and the Boise area, and obviously in the south, you've got the Medford area and Siskiyou County. Do we share? What kind of relationship do we have with the 4 bordering states, especially on air quality? Do we share information with them, especially in corridors where air quality is a big issue.
So there is a Northwest Air Quality Consortium, for lack of a better word, that works together on modeling around the area. And our folks at the lab work closely with the EPA region in the area, and also especially Washington. We work closely with on our air monitoring setups, and how can we implement, our monitoring? How are you doing it? What things are you seeing in your area? So we do certainly work closely with our neighboring states. And there is a formal setup for that where they meet, I believe it's once a year or even more often, to discuss different modeling and forecasting in the area.
Thank you.
Any additional questions?
Vice Chair Barrasso.
It's a comment that I wanted to catch myself on. I realized as I shared the sort of asking this question around consumer air quality monitors and just other monitors, I want to acknowledge that I know that they come at a cost, and certain people can afford those and certain people can't. So it's maybe more a comment, and maybe there's a response to it that I should have caught myself, that I do think there's a strong value in where DEQ places those. And so maybe that would just be one thing that asks, is to what extent there's a conversation on where those go and where those may complement areas where there's a nexus for why we as a public agency are going to add this extra information, where maybe there is a dearth of those consumer monitors, because they're 200 something bucks each.
Thank you, Chair Barrasso, for that comment. And as we move forward to putting out the additional, I believe it's 20 that we're funded for, and in hopes we can expand that, the air quality section will certainly look at, obviously look at areas of, missing coverage, but also considering other factors as far as purple air coverage, since we are seeing a lot of coverage in certain areas from those monitors. And it is a good point to potentially expand where those monitors are not, where people, as you say, can't afford those monitors, and we don't have that density of coverage from other sources. And as we can work more with those monitors and with that data moving forward, that will only become a better way to cover the state.
Commissioner Mosby, did you have an additional comment or question, or is your hand still up? Okay, great. Commissioner Kyle.
Thank you. And I love this report, so I'm already enjoying it very much. I just had a quick follow-up question. You mentioned with the purple air sensors that there's a regional correction factor. Could you just expand very briefly on what that is and who provides it and how it gets used, please?
So as far as the specifics of how they determine the correction factor, that I would have to defer back to our actual technicians in air quality, because I don't have a good explanation of how it's determined. But EPA has provided that as part of their work with the purple air monitors. We do a wildfire correction with our sensors, which is not part of the correction that purple air is currently doing, but it is determined. It is a correction determined with EPA. And so if you would like more the more technical detail on that, I'd be happy to work with air quality folks to get that for you, so that you can have the more technical information on it.
I may follow up with you on that, just out of own personal curiosity.
No problem. Thank you. Any other questions?
Let's keep going.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Hey, good morning, Chair George and members of the Commission. My name is Lydia Emer, and I'm the Land Quality Division Administrator. Land Quality is a coordinated group of programs encompassing materials management, emergency response, environmental cleanup, tanks, and hazardous waste. Today's presentation will share key environmental outcome measures for some of these programs. Next slide, please. The Environmental Cleanup Program identifies, investigates, and remediates sites where hazardous substance contamination is confirmed or suspected. Cleaning up and reinvesting in these properties provides many benefits. These projects provide safer places for people to live, work, and play, increase local tax bases, facilitate job growth, utilize existing infrastructure, reduce development pressures for undeveloped open land, all while improving and protecting the environment. This measure shows the total cleanups completed per year. Many of these sites come to DEQ through the voluntary cleanup program, where a property owner requests agency oversight with the goal of a no further action decision. These sites range from simple to complex and rely on cost recovery to recoup agency costs. Next slide, please. This slide tracks hazardous waste inspections over the last year. We currently have 533 facilities actively managing hazardous waste in Oregon. In 2020, DEQ inspected 56 regulated facilities, a reduction from previous years due to the pandemic. Some of the most common violations include failure to make a hazardous waste determination and failure to properly manage hazardous waste. DEQ is authorized to operate the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act in lieu of EPA. This means we must periodically review and adopt new or amended federal rules to retain this authority. We're currently working through the advisory committee phase of rulemaking, state adoption of 8 federal rules, with the goal of presenting our rule recommendations at the November EQC meeting. Over the coming months, you'll be hearing more about the chemical waste management permit modification and renewal. This is one of 2 transfer, storage, and disposal sites in Oregon and will require EQC approval for the permit renewal. Chemical waste management is seeking to expand its capacity to properly dispose of contaminated soils and liquids from large-scale cleanup operations. DEQ also received legislative approval for changes to a fee structure shared by the hazardous waste and environmental cleanup programs. These are partially funded through tipping fees, which are assessed when waste is disposed of at a hazardous waste landfill. Senate Bill 57A modifies fees for the disposal of hazardous waste by removing obsolete fees, streamlining a tiered fee structure, and increasing the one fee from $2 per ton to $5 per ton. Next slide, please. Moving to materials management. DEQ Key Performance Measure 11 tracks waste generation, the total weight of items in our garbage trucks, recycling, and compost bins. Our legislative goal is to reduce this. This slide shows how numbers have looked in the last decade, and that we are not moving towards our legislative goal. As you can see, waste generation has tracked economic activity. When the economy is busy, there are more items being consumed, thrown away, and recycled. So waste generation was low during the 2008 recession and has increased since then. We don't have final numbers for 2020 yet, but we expect that generation will be down due to the COVID-related recession. Next slide, please. KPM 12 asks us to track the recovery rate, which is a percentage. It's the weight of the items we put in our recycling and compost bins divided by the total weight of materials in those bins and the trash. Our legislative goal is to increase this and get the recovery rate above 50% by 2020. It's fluctuated between 40 and 50% and appears that 2019 will see a slight increase from 2018, up to about 43%. However, the recovery rate doesn't say a lot about Oregon's environmental progress. It largely reflects changes in business conditions. For example, it went down when China stopped taking recyclables from the Northwest and increased in 2019 when some businesses increased their use of recycled supplies. Next slide, please. However, waste materials aren't necessarily the biggest part of the problem, and recycling is one small step towards the sustainable Oregon described in the 2050 vision. Most of the impacts of materials come from things that are not in waste, like construction materials, which are really long-lived, or the food that we eat, which becomes part of our bodies. As a result, increasing recycling to 95% would only remove the sliver at the top of the pie chart from Oregon's consumption-based emissions. That leaves materials management with some challenges and opportunities. First, we're being challenged to find a way to do recycling right, an amount that supplies our industries and reduces impacts, but doesn't distract us from doing things that could make more of a difference, such as reusing things, redesigning them, and redirecting dollars. Second, we're challenged to reduce the harmful effects of overconsumption. Some of these effects are seen in solid waste, but some are invisible. Reducing overconsumption is not a traditional message for a government agency to deliver. Fortunately, there are some good opportunities to respond to these challenges. The passage of Senate Bill 582 allows Oregon to create a recycling system that makes environmental and business sense. The governor's executive order on greenhouse gases has reinforced the importance of materials management priorities, such as building codes, concrete, and procurement. Additionally, the governor's food waste reduction goal gives us an opportunity to talk about overconsumption as a personal and environmental impact. Buying food just to throw it away isn't good for a family budget or for the environment. In the next few years, Materials Management will be mounting a major campaign to help Oregonians waste less food, which fits well with the 2050 vision of living well while conserving resources. And that is my final slide before it is passed over to Ali and air quality.
Good morning, Chair George, Commissioners. It's good to see you all again. For the record, my name is Ali Mirza Khalili, and I'm the Administrator for the Air Quality Division. And you'll be hearing this a few more times, and I apologize for that today. Next slide, please. This slide addresses the key performance measure indicating number of days when air is unhealthy for sensitive groups and for all groups. This measure was developed in 2006 to reflect the annual trend in actual air quality by indicating air quality was unhealthy for general population on some days in some places. The majority of the unhealthy air days are caused by elevated fine particulate levels resulting from forest fires, wood stoves, and other combustion sources. This measure is based on the Air Quality Index, or AQI, which is an index calibrated to health-based levels for each of the criteria pollutant. In Oregon, the most important contributors to high AQI days outside of wildfires are ozone and PM 2.5. For these charts, orange represents unhealthy days not attributable to wildfires, and blue represents unhealthy days attributable to wildfire events. 243 days is very high at first glance, but the EQ measures at 29 sites, and these charts show that the additive days for all sites being measured throughout Oregon. So I hope that clarifies the numbers. The chart on the left shows unhealthy days for sensitive groups, which includes children, elderly, and people with existing medical conditions such as asthma, respiratory, and heart problems. The KPM goal is less than 20 days. In 2020, there were 7 unhealthy days not attributable to wildfires and 61 days in total. And in the chart on the right, you can see the number of days for unhealthy for all groups. The KPM goal is less than 3 days for this category. 2020 had 0 unhealthy days for all days outside of wildfires. As you can see, a large number of the most unhealthy air quality days per year are due to wildfire. 2020 was a record-setting year in terms of the worst AQI the state has seen since we started collecting data in 1985. And I think the snapshot that Lori showed you with the purple and happy faces indicated that one of the days. Oregon has seen an upward trend in AQI for wildfires and smoke since 2012. If this trend continues, we will see many more unhealthy days for all more areas of the state. Next slide, please. This figure shows the percent deviation from national ambient air quality standard for ground level ozone in purple, particulate matter in the blue and green lines, as one is daily and there was annual standard, and carbon monoxide in yellow. The carbon monoxide spike in 2020 is not a graphing error, but it is an aberration. The CO, National Ambient Air Quality exceedance came about because of the wildfires in the fall of 2020. Portland has been in attainment with the CO standard for decades, thanks to engine standards and to our air vehicle inspection program. In general, we are meeting these standards. However, ozone concentration measured in Portland in the summer of 2017, 2018, and 2019 exceeded the standard of 70 parts per million. Wildfires contributed to these exceedances by sending more volatile ozone precursor compounds. But since ozone is a secondary formed pollutant, we can't discern if we would have had ozone exceedances anyway because of other sources like cars coupled with high air temperatures.
Vice Chair Barrasso.
In this slide, though, Ali, thank you, Chair Georgia. In this slide, it looks like with ozone, though, there is a dip in 2020, and I mean that's when we had some of our worst wildfires. So it does, at least when I say a dip below, it looks like it's below the criteria level. And so I'm just trying to understand what you can share about, because I know you're potentially connecting the ozone exceedances potentially to wildfire, and yeah. So is there anything you can say about that?
Sure. Wildfires can also have a dampening effect on ozone formation because of they're taking away the sunshine element. When they bring that intensity in, and I think that's what we experienced in 2020. It does. It can go either way. That's why it's so difficult to discern what is it. How much of it is due to wildfire. There are some studies that show like 3 to 6 ppb of ozone can be attributed, but there is also a dampening effect based on blocking the sunlight. You need all three ingredients for the ozone to get formed. So I think that's partially responsible, but again, not. And I don't see the differences. I don't consider those to be a trend, to be honest with you. To look at these, I think we're, if I eyeballing the 2020 to now, I'd say we're flatlined, if anything. So hope that explains. So some of the programs.
Crowell, did you have something?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I apologize for the interruption.
Not a problem. So just real quick, some of the programs we have in place for reducing the criteria pollutant are vehicle inspection program, as I mentioned, the Heat Smart program for wood stoves to address particulate matter. We have the federal low sulfur requirements to address sulfur dioxide, the regional haze program to reduce the anthropogenic the contribution of some of the compounds that are responsible for these criteria pollutants as well. Our smoke management program to deal with prescribed burns. And in addition, we're working with local communities in areas not meeting NACs to address those and bring it to attainment. And finally, our permit program, it's designed to prevent exceedances of national ambient air quality standards from station resources. Next slide, please. So this graph is about diesel. The light blue line depicts Oregon's estimated emission inventory, and the darker blue is our KPM targets. As you can see, we are not on the right trajectory to meet the targets. As we've discussed with you, DEQ is developing and implementing programs and policies to reduce diesel engine emissions. These initiatives are organized around 3 strategic directives, and you're going to hear it again. Retire and replace the oldest diesel engines, adopt new, cleaner technologies, support owners and operators to upgrade their fleets. There is no silver bullet for reducing diesel engine emissions, and the work will require many and diverse strategies, including rules that we will bring for your consideration later today. Additional work to address diesel emissions on the horizon include dispersing nearly $50 million in clean diesel grants, adopting of zero emission and low NOx emission standards for new trucks, extending and expanding the clean fuels program, requiring greenhouse gas emission reductions from transportation fuels as part of the climate protection program. Staff are also exploring alternatives and interim measures to ensure that state is making progress toward reducing emissions. This might include annual statewide diesel fuel consumption, fleet turnover rates, percent fleet that's 2010 or newer, and or tier 4, or many other measures. It is also important to note that diesel pollution is not uniformly distributed across the state. Next slide, please. And we need to have some local measures. I think that's the point of this discussion. We've shared this series of maps illustrating the level of diesel pollution across the state with you before. Unsurprising, level of diesel pollution are highest in the state's population centers and along major freight corridors. The Portland metropolitan region experiences the highest level of diesel PM in the air. As you can see on the map on the left, nearly the entire metro area experiences unhealthy levels of diesel PM, with certain areas being exposed to levels more than 10 times Oregon's health-based standards. Nationally and in Oregon, environmental justice analysis have demonstrated that lower income people and communities of color are more likely to live in areas with higher concentration of diesel pollution. creating a serious environmental justice issue. The map on the right shows areas of metro area that with the highest concentration of non-white community members. A visual inspection of the two maps illustrates the clear overlap between these two census tracts and areas of the metro with the highest level of diesel pollution. This finding was confirmed in a multivariate regression analysis conducted as part of the Portland Air Toxic Solution project. Finally, I will remind the Commission that Oregon relies on a toxicity reference value of 0.1 microgram per cubic meter to assess cancer risk for diesel PM. Neighboring states, including California and Washington, have the toxicity reference values that are more protective of health, meaning they recognize a 1 in a million cancer risk at lower ambient concentration. Applying California's much more stringent value of 0.003 microgram per cubic meter to our emissions data would result in Oregon communities experiencing level of diesel particulate matter pollution, not tens, but hundreds of times over the health benchmark. Next slide, please.
So I hesitate, but I'm going to pause there. That is a really big deal. So we sit here to do our best to represent the citizens of Oregon. And as much as I respect all the citizens of our neighboring states, I'm quite certain that Oregonians deserve no less protection of their health. While I don't think it's worth going back at this point in the presentation and having a history lesson about, why it is that we have adopted that cancer risk grade, I want to highlight this as something that I think the EQC needs to come back to with our senior staff. We have seen this image before, and I think, and the comparison of the two, and it's a very, very important one to keep before us and keep before our eyes, and for us to do that with Oregonians. But I'm going to ask our staff to come back to this issue with the Commission, first so that we can understand it, and then number two, so we can potentially have other discussions about what we really think about that as Oregonians. Director.
Oh, Chair George, duly noted.
Thank
That's
you.
it. Yep.
Great. Thank you, Ali. Please continue.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So it's time to talk about the key performance measures for air toxics. DEQ has identified ambient benchmark concentrations, or ABCs, for 55 air toxics. The ABCs are a measure of the health risk posed by an air toxics. As the ambient concentration of an air toxic increases, so does the health risk it poses. For this key performance measure, 5 air toxics, cadmium, arsenic, benzene, acetaldehyde, and formaldehyde, were selected out of the list of 55 as indicator species. The target is to decrease ambient concentration of each of these 5 air toxics to be at or below their respective ABC by 2020. This is 1 times the ABC or less. If we stack the 5 indicators air toxics, we would expect the stack bar to be at or below 5 times ABC. To track this KPM, the Air Quality Monitoring Section monitors 5 indicators at 2 sites in the states: an urban location in Portland and a rural location in LeGrand, as shown on the map. So how are we doing with respect to these air toxic key performance measures? The yellow line marks the target KPM. We are seeing a decreasing trend in the KPM at both Portland and LeGrand from 2004 to 2019, going from about 40 times ABC to 20 times ABC in Portland, and about 80 times to 20 times in LeGrand. We are not meeting the target of 5 times over ABC at either location. Part of the reason is the change in ABC for formaldehyde from 3 microgram per cubic meter to 0.2 microgram per cubic meter. In practical terms, if formaldehyde had been at or close its ABC in 2018, it would be 1 times the ABC. That is the threshold of the acceptable risk of 1 in a million. But the same concentration in 2019 would be 15 times the ABC. The other indicators, if you look at them one by one, cadmium is in orange at the top of the bar. It has been way below ABC historically at LeGrand, and in Portland it has now been reduced to near benchmark concentration. We think it's due to regulation of art glass. Arsenic, the next in light blue, poses a greater risk in Portland than in La Grande, currently being around 4 times the ABC. It's been stable and at this level in Portland for the past 5 years or so, possibly an indication that the current risk is coming from volcanic soil of the region rather than on anthropogenic emissions. But this needs to be further investigated. The remaining 3 toxics, benzene, acetaldehyde, and formaldehyde, are cumulatively over 15 times the ABC in both locations, and therefore are the main contributors to health risk. Benzene increases in 2020 is attributable, in Portland, it is attributable to wildfire in September because of that coincided with our sampling event. Again, if you don't have any more questions, thank you for your attention and turn it over to Colin McConaughey.
Commissioner Kyle.
Thanks, Ali. I just have a question about those formaldehyde increases in the last 3 years, because that's a big jump. It's in 2 different locations, and it's enough to kind of indicate a trend. What are the suspected sources of that kind of regional increase in formaldehyde emissions?
Commissioner Kyle, thank you for the question. These are not concentrations. These are risk calculation. And I think that as I pointed out, that because of the risk factor changing, going down from 3 microgram to 0.2, that's the increase in that explains the
I see.
the length of the ball. It's not the concentration change.
The formula changed. Gotcha. Okay, sorry. Thanks.
Director, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was wrapping my head around the same thing. So in 2018 is when the ambient benchmark concentration target was changed and became almost more than 10 times more protective. But the numbers for 2004 through 2017 weren't adjusted for the new ambient benchmark concentration. So the jump is, I won't say completely, but largely attributable to the change in the target, not something that was going on actually in the environment. And please correct me if that's wrong, Ali.
No, that's exactly right. And perhaps we should draw a vertical line, indicating that there was a change in conditions. And I think that would clarify things. So we'll get that address, but that's not. No, concentration did not change.
If I might, Chair George, though, the point remains, based on our current targets, we are still significantly above where we want to be in terms of the level of these pollutants.
That's exactly right. Thank you. Colin, you're up.
Colin, are you speaking? We can't hear you.
I sure am, Chair George. I was on mute. I am so sorry about that. Good morning, Chair George, members of the commission. I'm Colin McConaughey, and I am going to walk through a couple slides here measuring Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions. And those are, of course, a metric of our state's contribution to global climate change. Next slide, please, Stephanie. Okay, there's a lot of information here on this slide that I'll unpack. The main chart in the upper left tracks our traditional, what we call our sector-based greenhouse gas inventory, and I use that qualifier because I'm going to talk about another way that we measure and track our greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Oregon. We have estimated our emissions back through 1990. But we really began tracking our emissions, and we actually discussed this a little bit with the commission yesterday. We began really measuring and tracking in much more detail our emissions beginning in 2010 with this onset of DEQ's greenhouse gas reporting program, which we now use that program to measure most of these emissions that we show here over the past decade. And They're stacked atop one another by sector, beginning with the largest and ending at the top with the second smallest, actually, agriculture. We put that on top because that's the one sector we don't get direct reporting from. Those other sectors we do. So you'll see, and I think as you've heard in the past many times, our largest sector of emissions is electricity, or excuse me, is transportation. The second being electricity, and then natural gas, and then residential and commercial are primarily additional emissions associated with those sectors from waste and wastewater. And then we have industrial emissions, which are unique emissions associated with manufacturing processes here in Oregon. And then finally, again, agriculture is the top there, and that's associated primarily with manure management, enteric fermentation, and fertilizer use from that sector. And so what you see here is, I'm going to say largely stagnation, if not a slight increase over time in emissions. Particularly, there's a big jump from 1990, and that's actually primarily from our electricity sector. So 1990, or in 1991 for that matter, are a bit anomalous because our electricity sector was, from a greenhouse gas standpoint, quite a lot cleaner because we had the PGE operated their Trojan nuclear plant. And that was began decommissioned in 1992. And so that began the reliance of quite a lot more fossil fuel for our state's largest electric utility. So putting aside those anomalous, I'm going to say anomalous first couple of years, it's largely a picture of stagnation, if not slight growth. Some of that growth is in transportation. But if you look along the bottom here, there are, I realize you can't see my cursor, so I won't try to use that. You see by sector how much they've increased. And actually the largest increase comes from end-use natural gas. While it's not one of our largest sectors, it has increased by over 50% since 1990, as there has been a steady increase in connections and expansion of our natural gas utility territories across the state. So wanted to draw attention to that. And then the one sector in which we've seen a decline is in those industrial process emissions. At the far bottom right, you'll see that sector has decreased by just about 20%. Next slide, please, Stephanie. Oh.
Vice Chair Barrasso. We can't hear you, Sam.
Natural gas end use. Thank you, Chair George. And that natural gas end use, I'm assuming that is, that's gas stove hookups and things like that, where it's not combustion for at the power plant, but it's us using it. See the nodding. And so is that trend line, that increase, is that a relatively consistent increase, or do we see periods where that increased more and less? You know, is that sort of like, are we seeing just a steady, been increasing from 1990 through now? It's generally been a steady increase.
Vice Chair Barrasso, I'm so glad you asked me that question, because I was actually just looking at that while I was listening to the other presenters this morning, and it's some of both. I would say when I looked closer at that data, there was a more rapid expansion in the 1990s and early 2000s, but there has been the overall trend, even in the past decade, is a slow growth. I think our largest natural gas utility, Northwest Natural, has reported on average year over year 1.5% load growth for the past 15 years, I believe, is the data I saw. So there's a slow but relatively steady growth, but a much more rapid period of growth in the 1990s when I think those utility territories, as I understand, actually expanded geographically quite a bit in that period.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's not, okay, thanks, Stephanie. And so here you see the left-hand side of this chart is the chart you just saw on the last slide. That's historically our emissions over the past 30 years. And then the right-hand side is showing a forecast of those emissions that we recently developed with a consultancy looking at business as usual with the current policies in place. Where do we expect emissions to go? And so try to disregard the yellow line for a moment. I know that kind of draws the eye intentionally, but I'm talking about the stacked blue charts here on the right-hand side. That trend, it dips down fairly somewhat dramatically, not dramatically enough as you can see, but relative to that yellow line, but it dips there, in the 2020s down to 2030 because almost entirely because of the electricity sector. Oregon legislature in 2016 adopted legislation, a requirement that Oregonians no longer be served by coal generated electricity in 2030. So that has a pretty dramatic effect on our electricity wedge there. That's the cause for that sharp decline in the forecasted emissions. But again, you'll see nonetheless not nearly enough of a decline to hit the yellow line, which is the goals. The hatched line is the 2007 legislatively adopted greenhouse gas reduction goals to hit 75% below 1990 levels. And then more recently in legislative discussions, as well as in Governor Brown's Executive Order 20-04, we see slightly more ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals with a 2035 target being 45% below 1990 and a 2050 target of being 80% below 1990. Regardless of which yellow line you're looking at, you can see that our forecast of business as usual is quite a lot higher than those targets. And particularly the more recent targets are based on really at a bare minimum of what science suggests we need to do as a global community to reduce our emissions and avoid the worst effects of climate change. And I'll add really a lot more recent science suggests we need to go even further still. So pretty grim, frankly, outlook for us as Oregonians doing our part on that business as usual. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to transition here to talk about that other way that we look at our contribution to global climate change as Oregonians, which is through a consumption-based lens. And if we could go to the next slide. So we're actually somewhat almost unique here as a state, and I want to really note that this is because of our materials management group and their development of this consumption-based emissions inventory. And what this is looking at is Oregon's, this measures our greenhouse gas emissions produced globally due to our state's consumption of goods and services like cars, foods, fuels, appliances, and clothing, and many other categories. Many of these are produced in other states and overseas, and this inventory accounts for the total emissions from producing, using, and disposing of those products and as well as services. The largest category, I'll note, is vehicles, and the majority of the total emissions from producing, using, and disposing of a vehicle. The majority of those emissions come from the use of that vehicle. That may not be a surprise, but as we know, almost all of our vehicles rely on gasoline or diesel to operate, and so most of the life cycle emissions from vehicles, again, the largest category in our consumption inventory, comes from the use. So that gets picked up in that sector-based inventory I mentioned earlier. But I'll contrast that with the second largest category, which is food and beverages. And there, only a small fraction of less than 25% of the total emissions from Oregonians' consumption of food and beverages comes from emissions directly occurring in state. The majority come from outside of the state as those food and beverages are produced elsewhere. And so what you see here on this chart is that our estimate of our consumption-based emissions tracked fairly closely, I'm going to say coincidentally, for the first 15 years as we've measured it. But in recent years, while our sector-based inventory, as I said earlier, I characterize it as stagnation, our consumption emissions have increased. And so you see a divergence there with our consumption inventory tracking an increase in emissions just over 80 million metric tons, whereas our sector-based inventory, again, those are the emissions really occurring within the four corners of our state. Those emissions have kind of flatlined around 65 million metric tons. And I just have one more slide before I'm going to hand it over to Justin Green to discuss water quality. Stephanie, next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight what I think is a really interesting outcome of our consumption-based inventory, which is its ability to show Oregonians' footprint, if you will, as household by income. And I just want to flag what you see here is a considerable divergence, I would say, to my eye, between low-income Oregon households, those with less than 30,000 household income, tracking at less than half the total footprint of households with making over 100,000 in household income. So, and you see the increase really, again, to my eye, as I looked at this, is across all those categories: transportation, healthcare, services, appliance, food and beverages, vehicles. So I think this really highlights an interesting and perhaps not surprising trend, but it really affirms what you might expect in this case, which is that it is the wealthier households in our state that contribute quite a bit more per capita to our global footprint of emissions. And I know we're short on time, so I'm just going to cut myself off there. Oh.
Commissioner Mosby.
Yeah, Colin, this was a great information here. The one thing, obviously, I'm a little biased because I came out of industry and manufacturing, and I hope that we publicize this a little more. Industry we're the most highly regulated group. We get the most grief from the public, and yet we're the only sector, we're also the lowest sector that you reported there, but we also have made the greatest change in the last 28 years. So hopefully a press or the media will pick this up a little bit, that we tend to denigrate industry probably more than we do transportation and the utility sector. And obviously ag surprised me a little bit. I didn't realize they were at 10%, but this is good information. We just need to get it out to the public in a responsible way. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I think with that, we'll hand it over to Justin Green to cover water quality. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair George, Vice Chair Barrasso, Commissioners. Justin Green, Water Quality Administrator for DEQ. The water quality program's mission is to protect, restore, and improve Oregon's water quality. Protecting Oregon's rivers, lakes, streams, and groundwater keeps these waters safe for a multitude of beneficial uses, such as drinking water, fish and other aquatic organisms, recreation, the ability to consume fish safely, and irrigation. DEQ accomplishes water quality protection, restoration, and improvement by developing and implementing water quality standards and clean water plans, regulating sewage treatment systems and industrial and stormwater discharges, and collecting and evaluating water quality data, providing grants and technical assistance to non-point sources, protecting drinking water sources, and providing loans to communities. Next slide, please. Our key performance measure is based on the Oregon Water Quality Index, which assesses water quality at 160 ambient monitoring locations across the state. These are stationary locations, generally chosen at sites intended to be aggregator sites, sites that are lower in the watershed where we might see effects of activities from upstream. The index aggregates 10 years of data for 8 parameters at each monitoring location to determine a high-level general water quality index score, which then produces an annual status and trends of that index over time. And so this figure depicts our performance in relation to 3 submeasures within our key performance measure. So the green bars represent the percent of sites with improving trends in water quality. The red bars show the percent of sites with declining trends in water quality. And the purple line is the percentage of sites in excellent or good condition. And so you think, looking at the variation over the last, this is 40 years, you would expect to see some variations here, especially higher improvements early in the Clean Water Act's implementation, and then those gains being more regimented later in time. Next slide, please. So the Clean Water Act requires states to quantify and assess waters within the state. To assess waters in Oregon, we use assessment units. This assessment uses the same data sources as the integrated report. So this is not just DEQ generated data, but additional data collected by other entities. This also uses continuous data for parameters where that's relevant, in addition to grab data. So as a result, we have data from throughout watersheds. Attaining is when results demonstrate attainment of the water quality criteria or TMDL targets in a 4-year status period. Not attaining is when results do not attain the water quality criteria. Unassessed is when there are no results available, or where there are results but no numeric water quality criteria or TMDL targets to evaluate attainment against during a 4-year status period. So this slide shows that we do a lot of work. There are a lot of assessment units for the more common pollutants. We do have data from a variety of sources that that can be put in that unassessed category because there are still limitations to that data. But we wanted to make sure that we highlighted the unassessed section. So we recognize that there's more work that could be done, but that also that is somewhat to be expected across the state. Next slide, please. So a trend assessment is made at a single monitoring station. With the results there have an underlying regularity and there's sufficient data over time. There must be water quality results in the same month for at least 8 different years over the entire 20-year analysis period. So this slide shows trends at specific monitoring stations for common Clean Water Act pollutants. So improving is when the result demonstrates a statistically significant trend in advancement of water quality conditions. Degrading is when the results show a statistically significant trend in deterioration. Steady is when there's a statistically significant slope that equals 0. No significant trend is when there's no consistent overall trend, and insufficient data is when we just don't meet that high volume and quality of data over over that 20-year period. And so what does this mean? We have not conducted a comprehensive analysis to determine the cause or reasons behind the statewide status and trend results completely overall, but there are multiple hypotheses that might explain trend results at stations, such as degrading trends linked to climate change impacts, change in stream flow, change in best management practices or treatment technology, stream channel and riparian restoration, normal year-to-year variation in climate that's not linked directly to climate change, as well as landscape disturbance like forest fires, forest harvest, or urban development. So those are all factors that can influence the trends that we're seeing at individual stations across the state. And these trends are related to that first slide and our key performance measures. So this once again is data that we really need a high quality and high volume of data to identify a significant trend. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the status of assessment units as it relates to human health and aquatic life toxics. The left side indicates how frequently we have data to assess for toxic pollutants. So we have human health criteria for toxics. It's approximately 130 pollutants. Such as mercury, PCBs. The bottom is aquatic life criteria. That's approximately 40 pollutants. That includes things such as copper, cadmium, and pesticides. And so on the right side, we're showing where we do have data, how frequently we are seeing exceedances of one or more criteria. So for both, we're seeing an exceedance about 1/3 of the time where we have data. So there's 578 assessment units assessed for one or more toxics using the human health criteria. 196 of those assessment units were impaired for one or more. We had 656 assessment units assessed for one or more toxics or using the aquatic life criteria, and about 224 of those were impaired for one or more toxics using that aquatic life criteria, for a total around 7,300 total assessment units in Oregon. Next slide, please. And so this is our final slide for this part of the agenda, and this relates to hazardous algal blooms, HABs, in Oregon. OSJ and DEQ have been monitoring cyanotoxins at selected drinking water facilities since 2018. We did about 100 facilities in 2018, around 60 facilities 2019. And it's a May to October monitoring season. And this graph shows detection over the regulatory action level in untreated source water. So this is the water that drinking water systems are pulling from before the drinking water treatment process happens. We haven't had a detection in treating drinking water in Salem since 2018. And we don't show on this low-level detections that are below the regulatory action level. But here you can see that in 2019 we had there are more areas over more extended period of time where there are HABs. 2020 in the orange, there are a few hits there, and so far we've only seen one. In 2020, it's the yellow dot in Go Red Prairie that we've only seen one so far that has come in above the regulatory action level. And so like I said, this is my final slide. Hopefully I didn't go through that too quickly. I wanted to be sensitive to time. But that does get us to the end of our State of the Environment presentation this morning.
Chair George, commissioners, that's all we have for you with the State of the Environment this morning. Any final questions or anything we can follow up on for you?
I just had a question, if it's okay. Sorry.
Of course, of course.
For Justin on that last slide where you have the detections of HABs or cyanotoxins in the source water, are you pairing this information with the treated water that's also coming out of treatment plants that is provided from those source waters to be able to see the difference between the environmental concentration and then ultimately what's ending up in drinking water supplies?
Commissioner Kyle, Chair George, commissioners, I may defer to Lori Pillsbury on that question, but I do not believe that we are doing that. And the Safe Drinking Water Act has its own requirements for waters coming out of a system. I do believe that the source water work that we're doing is to try to detect cyanotoxins very early on in the drinking water process.
I can add to that as well. So as part of the rule that was put into place a couple of years ago in response to the Salem water incident that we all remember, the initial tests are done in the source water. And so what this graph is specifically showing you is detections that exceed the action level in the rule. And if we were, and that occurred I won't say fairly commonly because we were testing 100 facilities in 2019. So it's really not a huge percentage of facilities, but you see it occurred more in 2019. And then what happens as part of the rule is if a facility exceeds the action level in their source water, they then implement testing of their finished water as part of the rule. So we would have a paired response, but we did not detect anything above an action level in finished water. So while we detected it in the source water, there were not detections in the corresponding finished water as part of this study. And so, but we do not test the finished water unless we have that exceedance in the source water. That's the trigger to then move on to the finished water testing. And so that's part of the rule.
So that would imply then that the existing water treatment trains are effective at removing cyanotoxins.
Correct. We haven't since the 2018 Salem closures had any detections in finished water as part of this that exceeded the action level.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I'd just like to thank our staff and all of the team who brought forward this presentation. We did go over, but I mean, what better way to do so? This is the summary, some of the roll up of the most important monitoring that DEQ uses and that I think the EQC can use to evaluate how DEQ is accomplishing its mission. And really, we could probably spend half a day on this easily, if not more. I just cannot help but remark, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. And I appreciate the various media and the way we move through the presentation, and we can see that in different areas. Folks won't be surprised that I am very focused on the water quality information. And we know, and some of the slides showed this, that different parts of the state, we're on different trends, and in particular, probably for different parameters, right? And that's not surprising as we look across this state and see some watersheds extremely impacted by human presence, and others not nearly so much. And just personally, I'll ask for your indulgence. One of the reasons that I'm particularly concerned is when I continue to look at this information about temperature. We continue to be in drastic, difficult situation and not improving in many areas for temperature. I mean, as we look across the state, I don't mean to suggest there isn't anywhere that improvements are being made. There are places, but as you look across the state, temperature is a desperate situation. At the same time, of course, we were just talking about drinking water for our people, and it's tragic that there's as much difficulty as there is there. But as somebody who lives and works in the Willamette Basin, we're certainly in the heart of this, and I would feel remiss if I didn't remark upon it. You know, Upper Willamette Spring Chinook and Upper Willamette Winter Steelhead were listed as threatened in 2005. And so we've had, what, 16 years of work. And so where are we? It was our job as a state to change that trend, right? And fish runs in the Willamette Basin have declined 98 to 99% from our historical populations. The 2017 steelhead run collapsed in the Willamette Basin, and only about 8.6% of the 50-year average, right? So that's a 50-year average. Only less than 10% of that showed up, was still here. And two core populations of Upper Willamette Spring Chinook are now presumed extinct. Another three populations of Upper Willamette Spring Chinook are considered at very high risk of extinction, and according to ODF&W, with a 60% probability of extinction by 2100. So these are the things that I worry about, and I worry how we are going to change these trends in temperature. And then just to, again, I'm asking for your indulgence here. I'm sharing things that are of particular interest, but what does that mean for one little Indian tribe who's steelhead in Come Up Agency Creek? Well, our returns in the last several years for steelhead, and we have a situation where we can count every fish returning to that stream. In 2018, we had 5. 2019, we had 3. In 2020, we had 6, so that's better than 3 or 5. But I guess I share this, and I ask for your indulgence for me to share this information, because I am just terribly worried. And I don't think in this last 16 years of listing, we have changed the trend, and I wonder how we can do better. So thank you for your indulgence, but I just needed to speak to that because it's something that concerns me greatly. Commissioner Mosby.
I will echo you again. The data he showed, temperature and pH tend to be the two worst trends in the last 20 years. And as someone, again, who is really into water and fishing, it's not the same as it used to be, I can tell you. So, and these fires aren't helping things, but the temperature is a huge, huge issue. And, you know, I really feel good. I think we've made, you know, we saw the air quality on the industrial stuff moving up, but we've really got to address these forest fires, these wildfires. And you know what we don't realize is 60% of our forests are public forests. They're either federal or state, or in some cases county forests. And again, some of it is forest management on this water temperature. When you have wildfires and you have over harvesting their streams, hey, you're going to have increased temperatures. And I will tell you what is happening to fish in the long run. It's going to impact the human population too. So I would echo your things. I'm really worried about water quality in our state. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Anyone else? Director.
Thank you, Chair George and commissioners, and thank you, staff and administrators, for your presentations this morning. Nice job painting a at best very mixed picture for the state of Oregon in terms of where we're at on our environment. On the waterfront, I would, to state the obvious, point everyone back to what we saw in terms of numbers around climate change. And we have local issues with regard to water quality, with regard to forest management, with regard to water use and water consumption and flow in our streams that we are working, trying to work through and with, but we're also dealing with this overwhelming influence now of climate change. And we're going to have to address climate change in order to really get our environment back into something resembling a sustainable state. And so that is a lot of your and our responsibility here in the coming years is to do that work. And I think the presentation today just underlines the urgency of that work. So thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you to all our presenters. All right, as much as we really could talk about this much longer, we do need to move on. So again, thank you, team, for the great presentation. But we do need to move on to our first action item of the day, which is the Regional Haze Division 223 rules. Welcome.
Again, good morning, Chair George, Commissioners. I'll wait for Stephanie to bring up the slides. Again, for the record, my name is Ali Mirzakalili. I'm the Administrator for Air Quality Division. In January of this year, we presented an update on our progress in fulfilling DEQ's responsibility to implement the Clean Air Act requirements for regional haze rules for the period of between 2018 and 2028. The Federal Regional Haze Rule requires states to report progress every 10 years towards achieving natural visibility conditions in certain wilderness areas and national parks by the year 2064. DEQ completed Oregon's first regional haze state implementation plan in 2010 and a progress report in 2017. You know, this rule is near and dear to my heart. We've been gifted with a beautiful vistas, and this rule is intended to protect the visibility in those areas. So the proposed rules we are presenting to you today for consideration comprise one element of DEQ's Round 2 Regional Haze Plan. The proposed rules pertain to the reduction of regional haze forming emissions from large station resources. Later this fall, we will bring you DEQ's proposed Regional Haze Plan that will contain our strategies to reduce haze forming emissions from area sources and mobile sources. The proposed rules, if adopted, would allow DEQ to issue orders to certain sources to reduce haze-forming pollutants, either by installing controls or agreeing to lower emissions, lower permitted emissions. To meet Clean Air Act requirements, emission reductions must be federally enforceable, meaning that in the likely event that DEQ was unable to enforce the reduction, EPA would step in and do so. DEQ does not foresee any reason we could not enforce the emissions reductions under these proposed rules. However, in order for EPA to approve our regional haze plan, any orders and agreements to reduce emissions must be included in the plan that DEQ posts for public notice and comment. I'll now introduce Michael Orman, Planning Manager to provide additional context for this presentation of DEQ's proposed rules. Michael.
Thanks, Ali. Chair George, Commissioners, for the record, my name is Michael Orman, and I'm the Air Quality Planning Section Manager for DEQ. In developing these proposed rules and working with facilities that would be regulated under these rules, DEQ balanced requirements of the EPA's Regional Haze Rule, EPA's guidance, and consultations with other states and characteristics and limitations of individual facilities that are reasonable to consider when identifying feasible pollution controls and emission reductions. DEQ intends to continue to work with regulated facilities to find solutions that reduce regional haze emissions while taking into account site-specific characteristics and limitations. DEQ appreciates the good faith and ongoing engagement of individual regulated facilities throughout this process. The conversations have been productive and we believe ultimately will result in pollution reductions and improved visibility. And with that, I'll pass to Air Quality Planner Karen Williams, who will present on the background and elements of DEQ's proposed regional haze rules.
Good morning. Next slide, please. Good morning, Chair George, Vice Chair Barrasso, and Commissioners. DEQ has been implementing our Clean Air Act responsibilities under what's called Round 2 of the regional haze rule since early 2019. Round 2 covers the period between 2018 and 2028. Throughout 2019 and 2020, DEQ has been consulting with EPA, with states, with federal land managers, with tribal governments, and a consortium that is called WRAP, the Western Regional Air Partnership. And through WRAP, states pooled resources to fund a regional model and monitoring data analysis. And as Ali mentioned, the Division 223 rulemaking that we're talking about today pertains to stationary sources. In 2019 and 2020, using our existing authority, DEQ requested information from facilities, and that's called a 4-factor analysis. That was requested from stationary sources that produce round 2 regional haze pollutants. And those pollutants are nitrogen oxides, or NOx, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter, or PM. Should EQC adopt these proposed rules, this would allow DEQ to issue orders to facilities to reduce emissions of those haze-forming pollutants. And as Ali mentioned, DEQ would then incorporate those orders into Oregon's larger state implementation plan for round 2 regional haze, along with all the additional strategies that DEQ will implement to improve visibility in wilderness areas and national parks. Before we post that plan for public notice, we must first consult with federal land managers, or FLMs. In this case, that's the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service. And then finally, after public comment, we would bring the round 2 regional haze plan to you for consideration in November of this year. Next slide, please. The 2 related but separate processes I just outlined, today's rulemaking and the larger scope regional haze plan, are illustrated in this figure that is a timeline. And we are today sitting on the lower right on my screen anyway, gray dot on the bottom of the arrow, considering the Division 223 rules. Next slide, please. Before I dive into the elements of the rules that we're proposing today, I'll say a few words about the area sources of regional haze pollutants and how DEQ will be addressing those in the round 2 regional haze plan. Oregon's emission inventory shows that a considerable percentage of haze-forming pollutants are coming from motor vehicles. Among Oregon's strategies to address such emissions are to propose adopting California's lower NOx and zero emission standards for medium and heavy duty on-road vehicles, implementing provisions of House Bill 2007 that prohibits titling and registration of older diesel vehicles in the metro counties, awarding grants through the Volkswagen settlement funds and the DERA Diesel Emissions Reductions Act funds to purchase new, cleaner on-road and non-road equipment, and continuing Oregon's Clean Vehicle Rebate Program. Then agricultural sources of haze-forming emissions include dairies and other confined animal feeding operations. DEQ does not regulate air emissions from these operations, but we can and intend to work with the Department of Agriculture and other agencies to promote best management practices and other practices that reduce haze-forming emissions. Smoke from anthropogenic burning, and that includes prescribed fires, open burning, and agricultural burning, as well as wood smoke from residential wood heating, all contribute to area sources of haze-forming pollutants as well. Forestry prescribed burning is regulated through a smoke management plan that was recently updated in 2019 and is in fact part of Oregon's state implementation plan. And DEQ will also continue to explore development of techniques that minimize or reduce emissions from burning, such as utilization of forest land biomass. And DEQ will be continuing a successful wood stove changeout program through community grants that have been authorized through the Oregon legislature. And again, as I've mentioned, DEQ will propose area source strategies to improve visibility in the Round 2 Regional Haze Plan later this fall. Next slide, please. With these proposed rules today, DEQ proposes to codify the strategy for reducing Round 2 regional haze pollutants from stationary sources. The facilities to be regulated are all Title V permitted major sources that emit at least 25 tons per year of NOx, SO2, and PM. And I'll walk through in just a moment the process by which the proposed rules would screen in or out facilities for further analysis and regulation. One of these 32 facilities that would be affected and regulated by the proposed rules is actually PGE Boardman, and that, of course, the coal-fired power plant actually closed in December of last year. So effectively, 31 facilities would be regulated. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the proposed rules would codify a process that DEQ followed to require regional haze emission reductions, and then it would establish the compliance options for facilities that screen in. And I'll now step through the elements of the draft proposed rules, and there are 4 of them. The first is a screening element whereby certain sources are identified to be regulated by these proposed regional haze rules. Second, those facilities must conduct an analysis to identify the feasibility and the cost effectiveness of pollution controls. Then facilities identify which compliance option makes the most sense for them, and they can agree to lower their emissions, or if that is not feasible, install controls on those emissions. The last part of the rule or the rules describes how DEQ makes those findings enforceable. And that is either by the facility and DEQ entering into an agreement, or if that is not something that can be achieved, DEQ issuing an order to the facility. Next slide, please. So this is a look in more detail at the first screening step. First, again, we are only looking at major sources, those with Title V permits. So DEQ summed the Q, or the total emissions, for each facility that are the emissions, or the sum of the emissions of NOx, SO2, and PM. And that those emission counts come from the 2017 emissions inventory, and those would be in tons per year. D then, lowercase d on your slide, is the distance in kilometers to the boundary of the nearest Class 1 area. Class 1 areas being national parks or wilderness areas of a certain size. DEQ calculated Q over D, Q divided by D, for each facility and each Class 1 area, including those within 400 kilometers of the Oregon state boundary. Then, in consultation with other states and in line with EPA's guidance, DEQ set the screening level at a Q over D greater than or equal to 5. And this captures 80% of the total haze forming emissions from major sources for all Oregon Class 1 areas. That 80% comes from EPA guidance. EPA guidance established that EPA would consider 80% to be a reasonably large fraction of haze forming emissions to capture in the round 2. Next slide, please. In the second element of the proposed rules, the facilities that screen in must then conduct what is called a 4-factor analysis, and that identifies feasible and cost-effective pollution controls. The 4 factors that must be considered are established in the federal regional haze rule. And those factors are, first, the cost of the control, the time to install the control being second. The third factor is the remaining useful life of the emission unit. And the fourth factor is what's called non-air and energy effects from installing and operating the controls. So DEQ, in order to be consistent in evaluating the 4-factor analyses that were submitted from all the facilities, again, followed EPA guidance to normalize certain factors, such as interest rates and remaining useful life of controls. And that was, again, to be essentially comparing apples to apples. Next slide, please. The next 2 elements of the rules lay out the facility's compliance options. One important concept that I'd like to call out here is the plant site emission limit, or PSEL, sometimes abbreviated. This is the limit to which a facility could emit in the future, and that allows for growth in the facility operations. Because the Regional Haze Program is essentially a very long-term planning program, and recall again that visibility goals for natural conditions should be reached by 2064, DEQ uses that PSEL value rather than current emissions in establishing what is a cost-effective control. The proposed rules would codify what DEQ deemed to be a cost-effective threshold for pollution control, and that is $10,000 per ton of pollution removed, of regional haze pollutants removed. And that's, again, calculated based on potential emissions up to the PSEL. The facility then must either install the controls that DEQ has deemed to be feasible and cost-effective, or may agree to lower its plant site emission limits so that that Q over D factor is less than 5. A PSEL reduction, in effect, is a bit of an off-ramp. A facility might also choose a combination of controls and lowering PSELs. And another compliance option available to facilities is to replace an emission unit entirely with a newer one that has lower emissions of round 2 regional haze pollutants. So a newer, cleaner engine, as an example. The proposed rules comport with EPA guidance to states that even if states are making reasonable progress toward those natural visibility goals in 2064, if pollution reductions are achievable, feasible, and cost-effective, DEQ must present those reductions to EPA and must enforce those reductions. So EPA has said essentially that making reasonable progress does not provide what is sometimes called safe harbor from continuing to make feasible pollution reductions. Next slide, please. The final element of the rules then describes how these findings are made enforceable. In order to satisfy the requirements of the regional haze rule, the federal regional haze rule, DEQ must show EPA that any emission reductions, and either emission reductions through lowering emissions or through control installation, are enforceable. DEQ makes these findings enforceable through permit modifications, but first, either a facility and DEQ will enter an agreement to lower those emissions, or, as I mentioned, DEQ will issue the facility an order to do so. DEQ then includes those orders and agreements in the state implementation plan that we submit to EPA for approval. Next slide, please. So this figure depicts the outcomes so far for each of those 32 facilities that I mentioned would be regulated by the proposed rules. And keep in mind that with our existing authority, DEQ was able to complete the first 2 steps of the process that I just outlined that would be codified in the proposed rules. We mentioned that the Boardman facility has closed, and a second facility essentially set aside is the Ash Grove Cement, and that facility had already installed maximum controls of regional haze pollutants in a prior action. So remaining of the 30 facilities remaining that were evaluated, 24 facilities, 7 facilities lowered their PSELs, so Q over D was less than 5, and therefore did not have to go through the 4-factor analysis. 24 facilities did go through that 4-factor analysis, and 6 of them found controls to be not cost effective. So not feasible, not cost effective, and DEQ agreed with those assessments. Then the remaining 17 facilities, DEQ has been negotiating with those facilities over the last several months to achieve the necessary emission reductions. Next slide, please. So we have completed the necessary public process steps for this rulemaking. We held a fiscal advisory committee on May 17th of this year. The public notice of the proposed rules was posted on May 28th, and we held the public hearing on June 28th, and then held the public comment period over the month between May 28th and June 30th. Next slide, please. DEQ developed a fiscal impact statement, of course, and convened the fiscal advisory committee that I mentioned to review that statement and to provide input. We then revised the fiscal impact statement based on the input that we received from the committee. Generally, the FAC members agreed that the proposed rules will not regulate any small businesses or members of the public, and DEQ does not expect adverse fiscal effects on the public or small businesses. DEQ does expect, and the committee agreed, that large businesses that are regulated by these proposed rules will sustain fiscal impacts. They are 32 facilities that I've mentioned to be regulated under these rules. Title V are federally permitted major sources whose processes emit round 2 regional haze pollutants, and they are geographically located near Class 1 wilderness areas or Crater Lake National Park. Next slide, please. For those regulated large businesses, DEQ expects costs to fall into 3 categories. There would be the initial consulting fees and in-house technical resources necessary to complete the 4-factor analyses. Second would be the cost of the pollution controls or unit replacements themselves and the operation of those controls. And third would be the associated permitting costs that would be required for a facility to go through to modify their permit to install to reflect the installation of new equipment. Next slide, please. As we described in the fiscal impact statement, DEQ expects indirect and beneficial fiscal effects on the general public and perhaps some small businesses. We have suggested there may be positive potential fiscal impacts in terms of local economic benefits from tourism in the communities that are near the Class 1 areas and the gorge. And as I mentioned, the pollutants that I did mention earlier in the presentation, the particulate matter, SO2 and NOx, also have adverse health effects on people. So DEQ expects the proposed rules to lead to some savings in public health costs from respiratory and savings from preventing or lessening respiratory and cardiac disease, and particularly to those communities that live near the stationary sources that are regulated. Next slide, please. So we received during the public comment period, we received about 240 nearly identical written comments that generally supported the proposed rules, but did not think they went far enough, because particularly agricultural operations, and in particular, Oregon's largest confined animal feeding operation that's located just east of the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area would not be regulated by the proposed rules. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, DEQ does not regulate or permit agricultural operations that contribute to area source emissions. DEQ does regulate one stationary source at the facility mentioned in Boardman through a Title V permit, and that is for a digester that generates electrical power from biogas combustion. At that digester, that stationary facility that we regulate, the combined permitted round 2 regional haze pollutants, NOx, SO2, and PM from that source total 92 tons a year. Based on those total emissions and the distance to the nearest Class 1 wilderness areas, the Q over D ratio that I mentioned at that initial screening step would be much less than 5. And the proposed rules would not require that facility to conduct a 4-factor analysis to reduce emissions or to install controls. So for those reasons, DEQ did not change the proposed rules in response to these comments, but remember, DEQ will address emissions from agricultural area sources, including CAFOs, in the long-term strategy of the regional haze plan that we intend to publicly notice this fall. Other comments. 5 comments were generally supportive, some calling out additional support for the proposed rules' potential positive effects on public health, on environmental justice communities, and the businesses in the travel and tourism sector. 2 leaning supportive comments expressed concern that the proposed rules may not comply with the National Scenic Area Act because they do not go far enough to enhance visibility, or again, do not regulate the CAFO that I mentioned earlier. And DEQ received 4 comments that were neutral, out of scope, or leaned opposing. The lean opposing comment was submitted by one of the regulated entities and was critical of DEQ's timing and control analysis findings. But please note that DEQ continues to negotiate with this facility. So DEQ did not change the proposed rules in response to the comments received, and our full responses are in your staff report. So I'm now going to ask Michael Orman to explain one change that we did make to the proposed rules, and I'll turn the mic over to him for the next few moments.
Thanks, Karen. Chair George, Vice Chair Barrasso, Commissioners, again for the record, Michael Orman, Air Quality Planning Section Manager. During the preparation of your staff report for this item, DEQ determined that the proposed rules inadvertently left out reference to one compliance option that DEQ made available to facilities during this round of regional haze planning. As Karen mentioned earlier, DEQ based compliance options within the proposed rules on EPA guidance, which included an option to replace units so long as those replacements occur within 10 years. DEQ presented publicly on replacement as a compliance option for facilities and included this compliance option in discussions with individual facilities. Although we did not receive a comment regarding our inadvertent omission of this compliance option, including this option in the proposed rules may be necessary for DEQ to complete the stipulated agreements and orders for facilities to reduce emissions. In some cases, a facility might find that it would be more cost effective for them to replace an emissions unit, such as a combustion engine, than to retrofit their current unit with pollution controls. This may be the most cost effective solution for a facility if, for example, they were planning to upgrade their engines with newer ones for energy or maintenance savings. A replacement also represents significant emission reductions, in some cases more than an emissions unit retrofitted with a control device. With the goal of overall regional haze program to return our Class 1 areas to natural conditions by 2064, the additional reductions from replacements will make additional progress and help Oregon remain on the glide path towards our overall goal. DEQ added section 2BE to the proposed 340-223-0110 in your redlined version of the proposed rules on page 65 of the staff report. The facility would have until July 31st, 2031 to replace a unit as opposed to being required to install controls by July 31st, 2026. DEQ also has added a description of this compliance option to the fiscal impact statement that is part of your staff report on page 12. And with that, I'll pass it back to Karen to wrap up.
And final slide, please. DEQ then recommends to the Commission to adopt the proposed rules in Attachment A as part of Chapter 340 of the Oregon Administrative Rules, to approve incorporating the rule amendments into Oregon's State Clean Air Act implementation plan under OAR 200-0040, and to direct DEQ to submit the SIP revision to the Environmental Protection Agency for approval. Thank you for your time, and we'll do our best to answer your questions.
We have comments or questions on the presentation? You know, the only comment I had as I was listening to the presentation and reviewing all of the slides had to do with the cost impacts analysis, which is required. We know that, and I always do appreciate seeing, as you put it up there, that there are cost impacts associated with many of the actions that DEQ takes or the EQC takes. And there can be negative cost impacts, and there can be positive cost impacts, and you showed that. And I've always thought it would be interesting and perhaps a more complete story if, to some degree, like NEPA analysis requires, we also evaluated the cost impacts of not acting, because there usually are cost impacts of not acting, right? And there could be negative or positive impacts of that, but that's really 100,000-foot issue. It's more philosophical about the way I look at things, and is certainly not really pertinent to the issue before us today. But it is interesting that we assume that there are costs of taking an action, but we don't always evaluate quite as well the cost of not taking an action. So anyhow, again, I apparently I'm a little philosophical today. I'll apologize for that. All right, any other comments or questions? All right, hearing none. We have a recommendation before us. Commissioners, would you like to make a motion at this time?
I can make the motion.
Great.
I move that the Oregon Environmental Quality Commission, make sure I'm reading, okay, adopt the proposed rules as seen in attachment A of the staff report as part of Chapter 340 of the Oregon Administrative Rules, and approve incorporating these rule amendments into Oregon Clean Air Act State Implementation Plan under OAR 340-200-0040, and direct DEQ to submit the SIP revision to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for approval.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes. Thank you to everyone. And I think we've even made up a little bit of time, so well done, everyone. Our next action item is the Title V program fee increases. Welcome back, Ali and team.
Thank you very much, Chair George, Commissioners. I warned you about this earlier. So for the record, my name is Ali Mirzakhalili, Air Quality Division Administrator. And with me today is Jacqueline Palermo, Air Quality Operations Manager, and Don Hendricks, Operations and Policy Analyst with the Air Operations section. Today we are presenting you phase one of a rulemaking which proposes to increase the Title V permit fees by the Consumer Price Index. The scope of this rulemaking includes an adjustment to Title V fees, which has occurred since 1993. This regular and modest increase was specifically designed to avoid large increases and facilitate predictable budgeting for affected sources. During 2020, DEQ made a decision to not increase the Title V fees by the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Each year, DEQ has proposed the EQC adopt the Title V fee increase by CPI, and these fees provide a wide range of services that are critical to protecting public health and environment. It is essential that Title V fees be increased to account for inflation and to ensure the EQ's continued effective administration of this program. Jacqueline will provide you with some background on Title V permits, and Don will then explain the proposed rules. Now I will hand the presentation over to Jacqueline. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Ali, Chair George, and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Jacqueline Palermo, and I'm the Air Quality Operations Manager at DEQ. There are two main air permit categories: the Air Contaminant Discharge Permits, or ACDPs, and Title V permits. ACDPs are primarily used to regulate minor sources of air emissions, but are also required as an interim step for any new Title V or major modifications at a Title V source. This proposed rule is for Title V, so we'll be focusing on that. Title Vs are typically the largest, most complex facilities with the most emissions. Title V permits clarified include all business air quality related environmental obligations and requirements into one document. The Federal Clean Air Act explicitly requires that the Title V program be fully funded through the Title V permit fees. These fees include emission fees, base fees, and user fees from the permitted operations. As the emission fees are assessed on a per ton basis, the industries with the highest level of emissions pay the majority of the cost of the program. Regular fee increases are needed due to program costs. Since the Clean Air Act required the program to be fully funded by these fees, a failure to increase could jeopardize DEQ's ability to maintain federal approval of the program. Federal regulation and state statutes authorize the EQC to adopt annual CPI increases to cover the cost of implementing the program. As Ali mentioned earlier, DEQ skipped the annual increase of the Title V program fees by the CPI in 2020. DEQ proposed that it is now appropriate to resume the recurring CPI adjustment to Title V fees. The CPI adjustment is routine, occurs annually, and would be difficult for DEQ to maintain the Title V program without this increase. Don Hendricks will now explain the proposed rules. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Jacqueline, Chair George, and Commissioners. My name is Donald Hendricks, and I'm the Operations and Policy Analyst with Air Operations. Thank you for the opportunity to present DEQ's Phase 1 proposal to increase the Title V permit fees by the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. First, I will provide context for this proposal, explain the proposed fee increases, and then provide DEQ's recommendation. Since 2012, DEQ has been using a two-phase rulemaking approach in order to save administrative costs. In other words, DEQ, per normal procedure, conducted one rulemaking, one public comment period, and one public hearing for both increases. Today, DEQ is asking the EQC to approve a CPI increase for Phase 1 of the rulemaking. Phase 1 of the rulemaking is a proposed 1.46% increase based on the 2020 CPI. Phase 2 is an estimated increase of 2.03% based on the 2020 CPI as of April 16, 2021. The actual increase for Phase 2 of the rulemaking will not be known until September 2021, based on the CPI publication by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In 2022, DEQ plans to return to the EQC to address Phase 2, which would affect Title V permit fees and invoices in the fall of 2022. Next slide, please. This table shows the current Title V fees for 2021 and proposed fees for 2022. The proposal affects several different fee types shown in the first column. First, DEQ is proposing to increase the annual base fee, which all Title V permit holders pay, to $8,489, an increase of $122. Next, DEQ is proposing to increase the emission fee from $63.26 per ton to $64.18 per ton, an increase of 92 cents per ton. Emission fees are assessed for each individual permittee based on their specific emissions. Finally, the proposed increase also applies to specific activity fees. These include fees for administrative permit amendments, simple, moderate, and complex permit modifications, and air monitoring reviews. Next slide, please. Public involvement involved the Administrative Procedures Act, including public notice, public hearing, and comment period. The proposed rules were put on public notice on April 30th of 2021. DEQ notified all Title V permit holders and an additional 19,568 interested parties via email and gov delivery. DEQ held a virtual public hearing on May 17th, 2021. One person attended the public hearing and 5 public comments were received. The public comments and DEQ's responses can be found in full within the staff report, but I will provide a quick overview of some of the issues raised, which include the amount of fee increases, program operations, emissions fees based on actual versus potential to emit, requests to delay the increase, and use of acronyms such as Title V. One commenter inquired as is the overall Title V staff levels, operating costs, and number of permit holders. Another commenter recommended that the fees be increased to support DEQ's effective administration costs to protect public health and the environment. Because the Clean Air Act and statute authorizes Oregon to increase Title V fees by the CPI and requires a program to be fully funded through permit fees, no changes were made to the proposed rules in response to the comments received. Next slide, please. In conclusion, DEQ recommends that the Environmental Quality Commission adopt phase 1 of the proposed rules in pages 30 through 34 in the staff report as part of chapter 340 of the administrative rules. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them at this time.
Questions or comments? Doesn't look like it. I think you covered it very well.
Thank you, Chair George and Commissioners.
All right, I will entertain a motion.
Happy to make the motion. I move that the Environmental Quality Commission adopt the proposed rule amendments on pages 29 through 33 of the report as part of chapter 340 of the Oregon Administrative Rules.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, same sign. The motion carries. Thank you again, everyone, for this. So it is now 10:26. That is not far off of our scheduled break. Very well done, everyone. So let's be back at 10:36. Does that work for everybody? Great. See you then. Thank you.
And Chair George, at this time, I will pause the recording until you reconvene after your break.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. All right. Let's get underway with the diesel retrofit rules.
I think I'm up again. Chair George, members of the commission, good morning again. For the record, my name is Ali Mirzakhalili. I'm the Air Quality Division Administrator, and with me is Rick Resnick, Operations and Policy Analyst at Vehicle Inspection Program. We are happy to be here today seeking your approval to adopt the proposed rules outlining approved retrofit technologies and certification for the medium and heavy-duty diesel vehicles. While diesel emission reduction technology has improved over the years, Oregon is still seeing significant pollution from older on-road diesel engines. One method to reduce the harmful emissions from these engines is the installation of appropriate retrofit technology. These technologies are aftermarket systems installed on a vehicle and designed to reduce diesel pollution. In 2019, the Oregon legislature passed HB 2007 in order to address pollution from older diesel engines. Today, DEQ is here to propose rules that establish the criteria for approved retrofit technologies for on-road diesel engines, the manner for which Oregon DEQ will certify them, and the verification required to ensure certification for the life of the retrofit technology. The bill also establishes deadlines codified in Oregon Department of Transportation statute, after which certain older diesel engine vehicles cannot be titled or registered in Clackamas, Multnomah, and Washington counties. DEQ's proposed rules establish a pathway for a person who owns a vehicle subject to the ODOT statute to continue to renew registration or title the vehicle. Next slide, please. So you've seen this before. The proposed rule aligns with the air quality strategy for reducing diesel pollution. These strategies represent actions that, one, address Oregon's largest sources of diesel emissions, and two, they are within our legal authorities, and three, can be completed with existing resources. Our strategy is one, to replace and retire all these diesel engines. This strategy refers to incentives and regulations designed to more rapidly transition Oregon's fleet and thereby reduce harmful emissions more quickly. HB 2007 accelerates the transition of newer, cleaner diesel trucks in the Portland metropolitan area. The proposed rules provide an alternative for truck owners to retrofit with approved technology. Second, strategies adopt new and cleaner technology. Again, this is designed to set Oregon up for success in the future and benefit from the rapidly changing technology landscape. Third, support owner and operators transition their fleets. States like California have seen the most success in emissions reduction when they pair regulation with incentives. Oregon's DEQ is currently accepting application for the first round of diesel emission mitigation grants using funds from VW cheating scandal. The grant funding was part of a legislation passed in 2019 under HB 2007 and will help with this transition. Next slide, please. As we've shared with you before, the map on this slide contains model 2017 exposure to diesel particulate matter in Portland metro area. You can see that many areas of the region are registering at least 10 times above the benchmark. This indicates that in these areas, there is a higher risk of certain cancer, lung disease, and cardiovascular impacts. The darker area contains higher concentration of particulate matter and surround the counties subject to the engine year phase out, unless they meet the diesel pollution reduction and maintenance requirements prescribed in the proposed rules. The DEQ's diesel retrofit compliance program will ensure that only proven and well-running pollution reduction technology will satisfy the requirements of the retrofit compliance pathway outlined in HB 2007. This will advance the DEQ's goal to improve air quality for some of Oregon's most vulnerable population, since these neighborhoods often overlap with areas that have highest concentration of diesel pollution. Next slide, please. So as we've shared in prior air quality presentation, the Federal Clean Air Act allows states to establish emission standards for in-use or on-road motor vehicles. Any standard a state establishes for in-use motor vehicles cannot be more stringent than the current new vehicle standards, as that would in effect be a new engine standard. For reference, ORS 468A grants EQC authority to establish emission standards and to establish a program for inspecting and certifying compliance with emission standards. The Vehicle Inspection Program is an example of Oregon's authority through the EQC to establish the emission test standards for in-use on-road vehicles. Section 7 of HB 2007 is also codified in ORS 468A and establishes the certification of approved retrofit technologies for older diesel trucks because of their higher emissions. I will now turn the presentation over to Rick Resnick, who will provide the Commission with the additional background and rulemaking effort, and we will later ask for Commission's motion to adopt the proposed rule. Rick, you're up.
Thank you, Ollie. Next slide, please. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Chair George, Vice Chair Barrasso, and members of the Commission, my name is Rick Resnick. I'm the Operations and Policy Analyst leading the retrofit compliance rulemaking and program implementation for the Vehicle Inspection Program. I would like to start by going over how we began down this path. As you know, the 2019 Oregon Legislature passed House Bill 2007, and as shown on this slide, the bill has several provisions for reducing air pollution from diesel vehicles and equipment. Section 7 of the bill, codified in 2019 Oregon Laws Chapter 468A, directs the Commission to adopt rules to establish what is approved retrofit technology, and the method of issuing a certification for diesel-powered vehicles with a gross vehicle weight rating of over 14,000 pounds. The two weight classifications categorized in House Bill 2007 include medium duty, such as box trucks, flatbed, and service trucks, with a gross vehicle weight rating of 14,001 to 26,000 pounds, and heavy duty, such as tractor trailer trucks, with a gross vehicle weight rating of over 26,000 pounds. The certification of compliance issued by DEQ would allow the owner to renew or title a vehicle per the Oregon Vehicle Code found in ODOT Statute Chapter 803. DEQ is working with our partners in ODOT to develop a retrofit certification process that will work with the existing vehicle registration process. Next, I will go over the registration, renewal, and titling phase-out dates for certain engine years as required per the ODOT statute. Next slide, please. So the first phase of implementation begins on January 1st, 2023, when a medium duty or a heavy duty truck powered by a 1996 or older diesel engine cannot be registered in Clackamas, Multnomah, and Washington counties. Oregon Department of Transportation provided the vehicle counts on the left from a report provided to the interim committees of the legislature related to transportation and the environment, September of 2020. The purpose of the report is to identify and address trends in the registration of medium and heavy duty trucks in Oregon over time, and to identify any effects House Bill 2007 may have on those trends. The next phase, January 1st, 2025, is when a medium duty truck powered by a 2009 or older diesel engine and a heavy duty truck powered by a 2006 or older diesel engine cannot be titled in the subject counties. Vehicle titling typically occurs when vehicle ownership changes, the vehicle is new to Oregon, or the vehicle's title becomes branded. DEQ does not have any current data on how often this occurs in the counties impacted by ORS 803-591. And the final phase occurs January 1st, 2029. This is when a medium duty truck powered by a 2009 and older diesel engine, publicly owned heavy duty trucks powered by 2009 and older diesel engines, and privately owned heavy duty trucks powered by 2006 and older diesel engine cannot renew in the subject counties. To put the age of the diesel fleet into perspective, by 2029, a medium duty truck with a 2009 diesel engine will be 20 years old, and a heavy duty truck with a 2006 diesel engine will be 23 years old. In addition, not all engines are good candidates for retrofit options due to poor engine condition or the age of the engine. So as the program matures, DEQ will have real-time vehicle counts and data from the Oregon Department of Transportation. Next slide, please. So within DEQ, the rules stand up a new program in the vehicle inspection program to review applications for approved retrofit criteria, issue a retrofit certificate of compliance, and verify maintenance and inspection records. For ODOT, two sections provide registration and titling, among other services. The driver and motor vehicle section provides the services for medium duty trucks, including publicly owned, and the Commerce and Compliance Division for heavy duty trucks. So on this slide, you can see the separate agency roles and the statutory authority along with those. ORS 468A directs EQC to adopt by rule criteria for certifying approved retrofit technology, prescribe the manner for issuing the certification, and provide proof of certification to ODOT. ORS 803-591 directs ODOT to implement registration and titling prohibitions in the subject counties for older diesel-powered vehicles that are over 14,000 pounds. Provide registration and titling services to the vehicle owners that are subject if the vehicle is equipped with DEQ-approved retrofit technology. And then they also oversee the process for vehicles otherwise exempt from the regulation. Next slide, please.
Vice Chair Brosnan.
What vehicles, thank you, Chair George. Rick, what vehicles would be exempt? Just can you give me give an example of like the vehicle exemptions and what that may look like?
Yes, so the ORS 803-591 includes a number of exemptions. Some of them, examples of those would be, motorhomes, emergency vehicles, log trucks, vehicles that have a certain, and I believe it's 5,000 miles or less per year driven on those, along with a few other exemptions that are specified in the statute.
Thank you.
Of course. Thanks.
Commissioner Mosby.
Yes, my question, again, you're saying trucks, diesel trucks, but you're using weight interchangeably. Where do buses fit? Would a diesel bus that weighed more than 26,000 pounds, would that also be categorized as a truck? You talked about motor homes, and that, to me, motor home is not all that much different than a bus. So I'm confused here a little bit.
Commissioner Mosby, thank you for your question. Chair George and members of the commission, that is correct. So the rules specify the vehicles that are subject to the tiling in and registration prohibitions, and they are separated by weight. So as mentioned, 14,000 to 26,000, and then 26,000 and greater. So yes, they are, the definition is a medium duty truck or a heavy duty truck, but by definition, it's the weight category of the vehicles that are regulated. So yes, a bus would fit into that classification.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. So DEQ convened a rulemaking and fiscal advisory committee that included 20 representatives from construction companies, small and large fleet associations, diesel retrofit installers and manufacturers, environmental organizations, as well as state and public agencies. The committee helped determine what retrofit technology DEQ should approve, and the guidelines for issuing certification confirming a diesel engine has been retrofitted with the approved technology. DEQ presented the fiscal impact statement to the advisory committee on January 26, 2021. And the fiscal was also in the public notice for comment March 26th through May 18th, 2021. So as you can see from the top row of this slide, there are 3 types of diesel particulate filter technologies available. The difference between the technologies is based on the regeneration method needed for combustion of unburned fuel and carbon particles. The engine displacement, horsepower, and regeneration method generally drive the cost of the retrofit. DEQ has included the approximate costs associated with the diesel particulate filter technology available, their installation costs, as well as the indirect costs associated with the maintenance and inspection requirements. The cost estimates are included in tables 1A and 1B of the staff report. The most common engine size for a retrofit application is 12.5 to 14 liters, and the average cost of the system is approximately $12,000 to $14,000. So the proposed rules do not create any mandatory costs because no person is required to participate in the program. They may create fiscal and economic impacts on those who wish to retrofit their vehicles and receive a certificate of compliance to continue registering and titling their medium or heavy duty trucks in the counties subject to the diesel engine year phase outs. DEQ's programs and policies can help those that choose to participate in the retrofit compliance program. The EQC has adopted separate rules, Environmental Quality Commission, authorized by House Bill 2007, and to implement a grant program for Oregon with available funds from the Environmental Mitigation Trust Agreement. The grant program will provide funding subject to availability to support the purchase of retrofit systems, as well as cleaner burning engines and diesel equipment replacements. Vehicle owners that apply and are awarded the grant funding will be eligible for up to 100% of the retrofit technology cost. Also, the DEQ retrofit compliant or retrofit certification is good as long as the owner participates in the program, and DEQ is not charging a fee for the retrofit compliance program. The committee agreed with DEQ's analysis regarding the fiscal and economic impacts. It provided comments and questions regarding the DEQ diesel emission mitigation grant program and the funding needed for small businesses that choose to retrofit their subject vehicles. It agreed that there would be a fiscal impact on small business and discussed ways that DEQ is proposing to mitigate those impacts. So in the next slide, we will cover the elements of the proposed rules. Thank you. So the proposed rules will be placed in Chapter 340, Division 256, and will be part of the Vehicle Inspection Program rules. Vehicle Inspection Program will not physically inspect retrofit installations, but rather review and approve applications, installation records, and inspection documentation. The new sections of the proposed rules include requirements for approved retrofit technology. So as mentioned prior, the technology installer must be authorized to perform the work by the approved retrofit technology manufacturer. The technology must provide a reduction of at least 85% of diesel particulate matter. Certificate of approved retrofit compliance. These rules detail the application and proof of installation requirements for the retrofit certification. Issuance of certificate of approved retrofit compliance. The rules provide a program review, approval, and denial for a certificate of approved retrofit compliance. It also prescribes the records required for the owner to maintain for a period of time. Annual renewal and periodic verification process. The rules in this section provide an annual inspection process to verify the retrofit technology continues to operate as intended by the manufacturer and without decreased efficiency. The second process is called a periodic verification that the program can use to audit records that the owner is required to maintain. Approved retrofit technology labeling requirements. The labeling requirements in this rule follows guidelines outlined for CARB-approved retrofit devices and allow for identification of the device, the month and year it was manufactured, and whether it is a CARB or EPA verified retrofit. Component swapping and redesignation of approved retrofit technology. So the rules in this section clarify the process for owners of a common fleet that may need to use one component of a system from a vehicle no longer in service to another one in operation. Next slide, please. Over the course of 3 rulemaking meetings, DEQ received input on the draft and proposed rules from the advisory committee and opened the floor to comments from the public. DEQ provided public notice and held a public hearing, April 26, 2021. The public comment period for this rulemaking was from March 26, 2021 through May 18, 2021. During the official public comment period and public hearing, DEQ received 1 comment in opposition due to the economic loss facing certain businesses from banning diesel fuel or altering diesel engines. Please refer to the comment summary for DEQ's response and the full written comment as provided to DEQ in the staff report. DEQ is not proposing rule language to alter diesel engines or ban the use of a diesel engine or diesel fuel. The proposed rules provide an exception for a person to renew registration or title of vehicle with a diesel engine subject to a phase-out deadline prescribed by ORS 803-591. DEQ believes that the extensive public stakeholder engagement, advisory committee work, and contributions help provide a clear and effective method for medium and heavy-duty retrofit compliance. This led to well-informed proposed rules that address the stakeholder questions and comments. Next slide, please. This slide represents the retrofit compliance program outreach and implementation timelines. As you can see, the initial outreach efforts for the retrofit compliance program can begin after the rules are adopted and filed with the Secretary of State, and the outreach will extend through 2022. As of last month, the Oregon legislature approved funding for 1 FTE and for technology improvements to implement the retrofit compliance program. The person in the new position will help provide outreach, technical assistance, receive and process retrofit verification applications, and support program operations. The main objectives for the outreach campaign include updating agency website information to include approved retrofit information, technical assistance, grant program information, and FAQs. Provide information to counties and municipalities subject to House Bill 2007. Mail letters to inform registered owners and businesses subject to the regulation. Work with retrofit manufacturers to provide installer information and resources, and provide information in presentations, webinars, and social media. DEQ will continue to work with ODOT partners to fully implement the program for processing applications for approved retrofit technologies by September of 2022. Next slide, please. So this brings me to the end of the presentation. This slide provides DEQ's recommendation. Chair George and members of the commission, thank you for your time. And I will now ask if there are any questions I can help answer at this time.
Commissioner Mosby.
Yeah, Rick, you'd mentioned earlier in your presentation that, you had different rules for Clackamas, Multnomah, and Washington County. And I'm wondering why we operate vehicle inspection programs down in the Medford, Jackson County area. Why wouldn't Jackson County be under the same mandate that we have for the metropolitan Portland area?
Thank you very much for your question, Commissioner Mosby, Chair George, and members of the commission. House Bill 2007 was enacted in 2019 and enrolled in the legislature, and we are operating within the outlined, the legislation operates within the outlined counties for registration and titling prohibitions. And so those particular timelines and counties are actually within the ODOT statute that I mentioned earlier. And it directs the commission to approve a list of approved retrofit technologies and the manner for which to certify those technologies. So hope that answers your question.
Deputy Director Feldon.
Thank you, Chair George. And I'm going to look to Ali to correct me if I get this wrong, but I'll just add, I think from an air quality perspective as well, the VIP program is really set up to operate in the areas where we've had non-attainment under the NACs. And the statutory change initiated by House Bill 2007 is directed at pollution from diesel, which if you recall some of the maps that we've seen, the diesel issue, not that there isn't, certainly diesel particulate statewide, but high concentrations of diesel in the Portland metro area that's really driving, I think, the rules and the statute here. So I just wanted to add that. Ali, is there anything you want to add there?
Deputy Director Fellow, no, that's exactly right, Chair George. I think we talked about the overlap with VIP program and the authorities that the commission has under that program for inspection, and that's where sort of the authorities for controlling in-use vehicles and how VIP relies on that authority. But as Rick mentioned, we do not intend to bring the trucks into the lanes for inspection. That's sort of I think that. If you see that we have a station in Medford for the light duty vehicles and not, that's where the I think overlap ends. The legislation defined the boundaries for which the program operates. And our program relies on the registration requirement and titling provision. So we couldn't make this, I mean, the retrofit is available, the funds are available, and we will assist for anyone who wants to voluntarily reduce and retrofit their vehicles in any area of the state. But this rule is put in place to essentially codify the requirements for those that will no longer be allowed to title within the 3 counties to get a pathway to do so by retrofitting. I hope that answers your question and makes sense.
Yes, Commissioner, go ahead and follow up.
Yeah, Ali. Okay, so right now in the Jackson County, Medford area, if I've got a vehicle or Mercedes diesel engine, do I have to go through the VIP program?
A heavy duty vehicle?
No, I said just a passenger car or a pickup truck. If it's a diesel, do I have to go through the VIP program to get my car registered?
I believe so. Rick, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, you are correct.
Then the reasoning you're giving me, this sounds like politics. I got to tell you, the reasoning you're giving me, then I think that you ought to exclude diesel passenger vehicles. And if the diesel is not a problem down in Jackson County and Medford, so with their air quality problems, so I'm not. This just doesn't sound right.
No, Commissioner Mosby, that's not. I did not say that. If that came across that way, I stand corrected. I did not say diesel was not a problem. I said is the titling provision is what drives the action here. So the titles in the for light duty applies to diesel vehicle down in Medford, but it does not for heavy duty vehicles, which is the weight class.
Vice Chair Barrasso, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, this is more, you know, when I looked at the list of the vehicles that were exempted from the requirements as it was come up, and this is not a question here because I know this was exempted from the requirements by the legislation. So I get that it's not within our it's sort of been said already, but there's just a piece of that some of that I hope we're keeping an eye on to really get a sense. And I get that that's a negotiated product in the legislature, but there's just some things in there that I sort of turned my head on. Maybe similar to Commissioner Mosby around some of the ways in which it was crafted, and that we're just still keeping a track on them. And then a second thing, maybe I wanted to make sure I really understood this because this was contrary to my understanding. Ali, you're saying for light, I know this does not regulate light duty diesel such as just passenger trucks that are diesel, this particular provision. But I do want to just confirm, you did say that those sort of vehicles, light duty diesel, does have to get inspected in the VIP. I ask this because I've seen enough times where I see enough trucks go that are without a doubt modified, and it can be that those are almost they become so blatant in your face that I've always wondered whether those trucks actually do have to go through the VIP program. Obviously, if they're in one of the VIP territories.
I want to make a distinction, Vice Chair Barrasso and Chair George. I want to make distinction between weight classes. There is a medium duty and light duty. I think we've seen some, and I think we mentioned that through one of the diesel the discussion we had before about the tampering that's happening. What we see on the diesel pickup trucks, sort of outside of the weight class that we are inspecting, we're seeing that happen. We are actually pursuing investigations as to into that. The retrofit people who are selling the defeat devices and installers of those. So those are ongoing investigations, and we're trying to develop strategies to address those. And I may be back before you, with a proposal to in near term to expand develop a inspection program somehow to address the tampering. Once we've developed the strategies, but that is a significant concern to us as well. I mean, the data that EPA provided, it's nearly 20% of diesel pickup and SUVs in a medium weight class has been tampered with in Oregon, and resulting in about 17,000 tons of excess NOx emission, about 170 tons of diesel PM emission increases in excess of what we anticipated. So it is a problem. It is something that we are investigating, and we haven't developed a strategy yet. It's not right to bring before you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right, I'm not seeing any. All right, well, we have arrived at the recommendation. Do any of our commissioners wish to bring forward a motion on the proposal? Yes, Commissioner Kyle.
So I move that the commission adopt the proposed rules as seen on page 30 through 49 of the staff report for this item as part of chapter 340 of the Oregon Administrative Rules, and approve incorporating these rule amendments into the Oregon Clean Air Act State Implementation Plan under OAR 340-200-0040, and direct DEQ to submit the SIP revisions to the US EPA for approval.
That was a mouthful. Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 And those opposed signify same sign.
Aye.
Thank you very much. The majority decides our proposal has been approved. Thank you everyone for your work on this. And we know that there is much more to say, and that we will be spending a lot more time talking about diesel, and in not very long. So thanks everybody again. Our next item is our director's report. Director Whitman.
Thank you, Chair George and commissioners. For the record, Richard Whitman, Oregon DEQ Director. I am going to try to make up a little bit of time with the director's report, but I am going to go through it a little bit more than perhaps is my normal, because there are a number of things in there that I want to emphasize for the commission. But before I do that, I want to start out by talking with the commission a little bit about work that is going on in the agency and in the state around environmental justice. And I have with me today Jimena Cruz Cuevas, who is in our cleanup program, but who also is one of a group of DEQ staff and managers who are working on environmental justice issues at DEQ, and really working cross-media, across our land, water, and air programs to educate staff about environmental justice and to help us with development of tools to consider environmental justice in the work that we do. I'm going to provide a really high-level introduction of where we're at on environmental justice, but I'm going to come back and talk to the commission more about this at your September meeting in a separate agenda item. But because this work is very live right now within DEQ, I also wanted to provide an opportunity for Jimena to present some of what's going on within the agency and really at the instigation and direction of staff and managers within the agency around environmental justice work. So with that, Jimena, I believe you're there. I am going to turn it over to you to present a little bit about the great work that you and others are doing on environmental justice.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Director Whitman, and thank you all for having me here today. My name is Jimena Cruz Cuevas, and I'm here on behalf of the Environmental Justice Work Group. This work was initiated by a small group of DEQ employees who felt the need to expand on our environmental justice efforts. It currently holds about 50 people representing all media regions and a variety of programs across the agency. Next slide, please. I want to make sure that we begin with the same understanding of what environmental justice is. And in order to do that, we need to distinguish the difference between equality and equity. Distributing resources equally when inequality already exists within a society only serves to heighten the imbalance over time. Therefore, in a society where inequality exists, resources have to be distributed in a way that will take this existing inequality into account in order to achieve true equity. Justice, however, is more than the equitable distribution of resources. It calls on us to not only address inequality, but to examine the institutions and societal dynamics that give rise to the inequality in the first place. Justice calls upon us to reimagine our social structures and institutions and recreate them so that we can live in a world that promotes true equality. Historically marginalized communities have faced many societal injustices, and to add to that list also includes environmental injustices. Just to name one example, we could look at how diesel exposure is higher in areas where there are higher populations of low income and minority populations. In order to tackle the problem, we first have to define our scope. We know environmental justice is a significant part of our work, and we are here to tell you about how the Environmental Justice Work Group will further define the scope and how we can adjust our systems, processes, and policies to address environmental justice. Next slide, please. It is imperative that DEQ is not only present in the space of environmental justice, but that we are leaders in it. We need to work with other agencies on equity, but also go beyond that to look at systemic barriers that disproportionately impact communities through understanding cumulative burden. And we need to provide that information and how to use it to other agencies. We are the environmental agency with the data and the expertise poised to do this work. We have to remember that at its roots, the environmental justice movement has always been a bottom-up approach. Had it not been for people organizing and taking to the streets, we would not have the EPA or Earth Day. In conducting this work, we have to go beyond data by forging relationships with communities through listening and involving them in the process, because it is of the utmost importance. As the EJ work group, we want to understand the work already happening at DEQ across media and create necessary tools and best practices for success. Environmental justice should not be an extra lens of our work. It should be ever present in all that we do and how we function as an agency. Next slide, please. The Environmental Justice Work Group is currently drafting a charter to outline the scope of what we hope to accomplish. We created a multifaceted approach in order to encompass as much of what we currently foresee as being essential for the work. First, the technical group will create an environmental justice screening tool to look something like CalEnviroScreen, and to do this, they'll need to gather data for all media, identify data gaps so that they can assess cumulative impact, create methodology, and build capacity for the tool. The education group will take the lead in bringing us from the concept of environmental justice as a fundamental and default understanding of both the need and what environmental justice is to DEQ. They'll also develop education and outreach materials and create best practices. Communications will develop ways to convey environmental justice with internal and external stakeholders, build collaboration with other agencies, and aid other agencies in implementation of environmental justice. Now, these are all long-term iterative concepts that are tied to deliverables that must be done. Next slide, please. In our charter, we have begun to outline steps that will be essential in laying the groundwork for our approach. The charter is meant to get us moving, but it is important that we note that we don't know what we will discover during our research. As we engage with communities and other agencies, we may see there are different tools or approaches that we need. It is important that we are flexible and that we realize that this work is constantly evolving and will require that we are patient and acknowledge our mistakes along the way and always strive to do better. As next steps, we are going to bring awareness and begin collaboration on environmental justice approaches to our work. We'll also complete the charter that will outline the foundation of this work, but in order to do so, we will need funding and resources to complete this work. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll hand it back to Director Whitman.
Thank you so much for going over that and this important work.
Thank you, Jimena. That was great. And I'll just emphasize, Jimena is a great spokesperson for this work group, but she represents a fairly large group of staff and managers who are really vitally interested in this work and really see it as the next generation of environmental work in Oregon, and work that is very intentional about dealing with the long-term burdens that have been placed on vulnerable and underrepresented communities in Oregon, in a way that works to reverse those burdens over time. So I'm going to pick up where Jimena left, which was on the funding and resource piece. So Senate Bill, you heard yesterday what a great legislative session it was and how much the Oregon legislature accomplished during the session, for which we're very grateful. However, there were a few disappointments, and one of those disappointments was with regard to legislation that Oregon Governor Brown proposed, which did get a hearing, did pass out of committee, went to the Ways and Means Committee, had several hearings actually, and had a significant support in the legislature, but did not ultimately get moved out of the Ways and Means Committee and passed by the legislature. That legislation would have transformed the Environmental Justice Task Force into the Environmental Justice Council, a permanent body with slightly different and broader representation, and also would have importantly given the Environmental Justice Council resources to actually do work rather than simply advise, cajole, push, prod state agencies. So that has not happened. However, the work does not stop. And what you heard from Jimena this morning is the determination of DEQ staff and managers and leadership to continue the work with the resources that we have available. So we will continue working in this space. We will continue working cross media and working to reach out to our communities, to engage with them and also hear from them about how to make this part of our everyday work. So even though we have not gotten new resources, how do we take the programs and work that we are already doing and assure that we are being intentional about environmental justice as a core component of that work? The other thing I want to mention, and I'll be talking about this more in September at the separate agenda item, is there is also an effort across state agencies and also between state agencies and other partners around environmental justice work, and specifically the analytical tools piece of this. So as Jimena mentioned, California has developed a tool called Cal Environmental Screen, which is now, I think, in its 4th iteration. The state of Washington has a similar tool adapted to the particular needs of the state of Washington. Other states across the country have developed their own versions of this sort of analytical tool. And most recently, the state of New Jersey passed legislation requiring environmental justice analysis of major policy and programmatic actions in that state, and is using a state environmental justice analytical tool. The Oregon legislature in this past session, even though it did not pass Senate Bill 286, did pass a number of both policy and budgetary actions that have components of environmental justice in them. So for instance, the 100% clean electricity legislation, House Bill 2021, has a $50 million clean energy fund for administered by the Oregon Department of Energy, with direction to the Oregon Department of Energy to prioritize funding projects in essentially environmental justice communities. There's similar direction to the Oregon Public Utilities Commission. The Oregon Health Authority is doing similar sorts of work in some of the programs that they administer. So most recently, at the urging of a number of agencies, the governor's office has convened a high-level cross-agency work group that includes DEQ, along with the Department of Energy, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, the Oregon Health Authority, Oregon Department of Transportation, for us to figure out how we can work together to create a tool, a shared definition of what environmental justice communities are, and a tool that will help us in the work that we all do consider environmental justice. So that work is progressing. It is at relatively early stages. It does not have consolidated resourcing, but it does have some resources. And we are working to determine how to pull all that together, to work with academia, and most importantly, to work with communities, to get community input into if we are going to develop an Oregon-specific tool, to get input from our Oregon environmental justice communities about what should go into that tool. So that's the main thing that I wanted to say for today. In September, hopefully I'll have more to report on what's going on cross-agency in Oregon, working with Oregon communities, and also to talk more about what's going on at the federal level with the Biden administration and our Federal Environmental Protection Agency, which is also putting resources into this work as well. So with that, let me pause and just see if there are questions from the commission today about this really important and frankly, long overdue and very exciting work that's going on at multiple levels.
I don't see any questions. I guess I'd just like to emphasize your last statement, Director. This is incredibly important work, and it should be at the foundation of everything that we do. And so I, for one, look forward to hearing more. And as these plans start to materialize and play out, we look forward to getting regular updates, and want to thank Amina for her lovely overview of what's going on. And I really appreciate seeing your and her and DEQ's enthusiasm about moving forward with this work. Vice Chair Brasso.
I want to echo what Chair George said, and it's I think sometimes it's I appreciate, I agree that it's long overdue, and I appreciate that we're coming. It's almost you know, this conversation has been happening for so many years. I mean, I think the EJ task force, I don't know, got started in the late 2000s or so. So it's been a long time coming. And so I appreciate, Richard, also just your comment around the fact that, like, what does it mean to, as opposed to having a body that has to cajole agencies to actually position them so that they are positioned to meaningfully influence in a way that they're not positioned to do now. So hearing that gives me hope that those are more real conversations that are happening on how to position that and make that happen. And so I just I think sometimes it can be easy to get cynical, and despite that, it gives me hope that there are these conversations that folks are elevating to this point. So I know that yeah, this is certainly near and dear, and it's a place that at times you get burned, and as these conversations come back, I'm definitely eager to support it however I can. So that's I'm excited we're here. It's certainly long overdue. So and I want to just not congratulate, but just just acknowledge and appreciate the work that is coming up through DEQ. That's important, and that is the way the work needs to come up. It needs to come up through the individuals that are feeling called to this, and at the same end, we need to get everyone else called to this too.
Thank you, commissioners, and thank you, Jimena, and the work group, and the members. Some of the members of the work group asked me a while ago what the commission could bring to this effort, also, and I said the main thing the commission can do is really help assure that keep our feet to the fire, make sure that we are staying on this work, centering this work in our day-to-day efforts in everything that we do. And so that was part of why I wanted Jimena to come and present today. We'll provide future opportunities for that group to converse with the commission also. And I think together, having the energy from staff and managers who are doing the day-to-day work and having the attention of the commission will help assure that this really does become part of the culture of the agency permanently. So that's really all I have for today on this. So with that, let me transition and talk a little bit now about some other things. And the first thing that I want to do is respond to three things that came up in public forum yesterday. And as commissioners know, we have tried to design the structure of our commission meetings to allow this for people, when people do bring up issues in public forum, for there to be a little bit of opportunity for us to provide information back to the commission about those issues on the following day or later in the meeting as part of the director's report. So I don't have exhaustive responses to the very thoughtful and detailed comments that you got in public forum yesterday, but I will briefly address three things that were brought up. One of those was the Riverbend landfill in Yamhill County. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. We also had comments about the TMDL rules that we expect to bring to the commission early next year. I'll talk about that briefly, and the Rules Advisory Committee issue. And then finally, we had lots of comment about the the Climate Protection Program and several aspects of that. And I'll touch a little bit on some of that as well. But let me start with Riverbend landfill, which I've been hearing about ever since I became DEQ director, and actually before. And I think you all have been hearing about for a long time. I know a lot of people have been concerned about and struggling with impacts from Riverbend for many years. And we are continuing to move along, the road of the evolution of that facility, but it has not closed. It has closed the area of the landfill that accepts waste from the public, and it has closed the recycling component of the facility, but it is still accepting some construction waste and other waste at a reduced volume. And there is still area within the existing permitted footprint of the landfill that is fully permitted to accept waste. So the request that we heard from several members of the public and neighbors yesterday was that DEQ require that Riverbend submit an application for a closure permit. And I will say that is under discussion within DEQ right now. And we are evaluating what the status of the facility is and whether it is the time under your rules, your solid waste rules, where we would require a closure permit to be submitted. Your rules specify that a closure permit is to be submitted within, and I'm paraphrasing here for those who are following closely, this isn't a exact recitation of the rules, but essentially that a closure permit be submitted within 5 years of the time the operator expects to close the facility. The main things that the operator is required to submit with a closure permit is a closure plan and a post-closure plan. And for a landfill like this, a large landfill, there will be a period of 25 or to 30 years or more following closure that the permit holder will be required to continue essentially operating the facility, monitoring the cap, monitoring any gas, methane gas being produced by the landfill. And so they will continue to operate under a closure permit. And so that's why your rules are set up the way they are. The closure permit application is submitted about 5 years before the final closure of the facility. The main components of the closure permit application are a closure plan and a post-closure plan. We have received those plans from the permittee, and so much of the detailed engineering and technical work on what will be required when the facility is closed has been submitted by the permittee, but we have not yet formally required a closure permit application. So as I said, that's still under discussion within DEQ, and we're looking at the technical information we have regarding the landfill and what our practice has been with regard to when we require a closure permit and applying it to the facts of the situation. We're not quite there yet on a decision. So that's the main thing I wanted to say about Riverbend. I will note one last thing, which is the land use application that Riverbend made to Yamhill County for an expansion that Yamhill County denied is still on appeal. And it's still on appeal in the Oregon Court of Appeals. It was denied by the county. The Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals upheld that denial, and it has been appealed to the Oregon Court of Appeals. So as much as, I'd like to be able to tell people what the trajectory is here with some certainty, that avenue is still open. The permittee can always reapply for expansion. So even after we require a closure permit from the facility, there's nothing that I am aware of that legally prevents the operator from coming back and still applying to the county for an expansion. They would require a modification of the solid waste permit also, but those possibilities will remain even after we do require a closure permit for the current landfill. So I'm not trying to sow more confusion here. I'm just trying to be realistic about when there is certainty or not certainty about what the future holds for this facility. So any questions from commissioners? Keith Anderson, who's the Western Region Administrator, is not here today. We can, if the commission wants to get into more detail about Riverbend, I probably would want to have Keith and technical staff here to engage more with the commission on that.
Okay.
But that's about all I have for today.
So I had a couple questions, but I think they're of a more general nature. So one does have to do, and I hear what you're saying about them still accepting certain construction waste and possibly a few other things. I can certainly appreciate, though, from the public's perspective, a large or operation like that was accepting, material from the public, as you say, had a large recycling area, and now none of those services are available to the public anymore. I can understand how, from the public's perspective, those are the services they expect, from a landfill. And when they're told that they're not available anymore and the gates are always closed when they used to be open, it feels like that facility has closed down. So I don't know. It may be one of the issues that DEQ is still having to look at. But, what is the definition in a community context of closure? And I don't know if that's one of the issues that's being investigated right now.
Chair George, that is one of the issues that we're looking at right now, and in terms of when a closure permit would be required. And part of it has to do with, what waste are they continuing to accept? What's the volume of that? What's the area in the permitted area in the landfill that can continue, and looking at what the timing of that is. So those are all things that we're looking at right now. My understanding is that there is a transfer station, and you may know more than I do, but there is a transfer station that is accepting material from the public, and also, I believe, recycling material as well. But yes, those portions of this particular facility have stopped operating for now.
Okay. And then my only other question, or I guess follow-up, was one of the issues that we've heard about, and certainly that was true yesterday, but is kind of like transparency and openness with the local impacted community, right? So we heard some comments about an EPA related finding, and kind of the desire, apparently, at least I think like the comment was made that information about that wasn't shared with the local county. And I do know that the closure was a big shock to the community, the public closure to the public, I should say, including the local county commissioners, et cetera. And so the reality, while there's benefits of having these kinds of facilities in our communities, and there's challenges associated with these types of things, the one thing is we do know that our communities come to depend on them. And so I don't know if there's any way in which we can facilitate or ask for any type of transparency or willingness to work with the impacted community.
We have been in contact with county commissioners about the status of the landfill. I know Western Region Administrator Keith Anderson has been in contact, and there's a little bit of email back and forth from me also with one of the county commissioners. So we're trying to help provide information to and be responsive to county commissioners when they have questions in terms of the facility being more transparent with the public. We can certainly pass that request on to the operator and suggest that they could be doing a better job in terms of clarity with the public about their operations. And certainly I will do that, Chair George. But there's only so much we can do with the facility, and we can suggest that they could be doing a better job there, but there's not a specific requirement in our permit that gives us a direct regulatory handle on that.
Sure, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Whereas in other cases under the regulations, sometimes there are requirements associated with that, but not here. Okay, understood. I'll stop now and let you move on.
Okay, no problem. All right, that was one of the issues. The next two are probably a little bit shorter and more straightforward. On the TMDL rule that you heard an informational presentation on yesterday, Oregon law requires a rules advisory committee if it is requested by more than a particular number of individuals. We had several requests for a rules advisory committee yesterday in the public forum. And I think I have not talked with Deputy Director Felden about this yet, but I can see the handwriting on the wall. We are going to have a rules advisory committee for that rulemaking, and that's fine. That's what we've got our public process for, and we'll make it work. The timing is going to be challenging, but we will have a rules advisory committee. We will make sure that the interests that testified yesterday have an opportunity to be on the rules advisory committee and make their concerns known through that process. And I will, however, emphasize what staff said in the presentation yesterday, which is this is not intended to be a big policy-making, rulemaking. This is intended to align the options for directing TMDL decisions to the commission or to the director, which that authority already exists in statute expressly, and your predecessors limited that authority by rule, and we're simply removing that limitation. The definition of reasonable assurance, which was the second component of that rulemaking, again, as staff said, that is already defined in federal law, and all we're doing is adopting that federal definition. The third area, which was this concept around responsible person, I think we'll look at a little bit more. And frankly, if there are significant policy issues there, it would be my intent to remove that from the proposed rule and leave that for later discussion with the commission at some future time. We really want to keep this particular rulemaking fairly, pretty cut and dried, because of timing. To have it in place to undertake work on the temperature TMDLs, it does need to get done in fairly short order here. So we heard the comments yesterday, we're responding to them, and that's what our public process is for, and it's all good.
Vice Chair, did you have something, or did Richard cover it?
Okay.
He covered it, great. All right.
The third thing is on the Clean Power Plan, sorry. Boy, that's showing my age. That's Obama administration. So let's, the Climate Protection Program. I've been working on climate stuff maybe a little bit too long. On the Climate Protection Program rules, we heard a couple of things yesterday. A lot of concern about not including electricity generation under the cap. We continue to hear that concern. And I will reiterate what I have said earlier. The reason that we do not have Oregon-based power plants within the cap is twofold. Number one, we believe there is an authority problem with the commission regulating those emissions under the cap. And essentially the problem is that the legislature has already addressed in separate legislation dating back to the mid-1990s greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, and through the energy facility siting process, given that authority to the Energy Facility Siting Council. And as a result, we question whether the authority exists. The general authority that EQC has extends to natural gas fired power plants. And then secondly, and more importantly, the preferred approach for addressing those emissions was to prohibit the use of electricity in Oregon that comes from fossil fuel sources, whether they're located within Oregon or outside of Oregon. And that is what the Oregon legislature just did in House Bill 2021, which gives the Oregon Public Utilities Commission the authority and direction to require our utilities to get off of fossil fuel electricity by 2040 completely. So those graphs that you saw in the State of the Environment presentation earlier today that showed a big wedge of greenhouse gas emissions from electricity continuing on all the way to 2050. Well, actually, with the change in policy from House Bill 2021, that wedge will disappear by 2040. So there is a continuing issue with regard to the possibility that those power plants could be used to generate electricity that is used outside of Oregon. And that is a longer conversation, but at a very high level, with Oregon going to 100% clean electricity, with Washington having already gone to 100% clean electricity, and with California also having gone to 100% clean electricity, there is not going to be anywhere to sell that electricity in the relatively near future. You know, there already is generation that serves Idaho and Utah and Nevada, and those markets are not growing and are not large. And so the potential for those power plants to continue operating, be sold to entities that sell the electricity out of state is pretty low. I'm not saying it's not an issue at all. It's one that we will need to have longer conversations with the Energy Facility Siting Council and the Oregon Department of Energy about, but it is not in my view, a significant pressing issue in terms of getting on the path to reducing greenhouse gas emissions quickly here in Oregon. It's more a long-term issue. So other issues that came up in the public forum yesterday, concern about the community climate investment aspect of the program. And there are, part of that concern was the use of banking, particularly in early years, to meet compliance obligations and to do a large amount of banking in early years. I think that's a legitimate concern. It's one that I'm going to talk with staff about. And you may see more changes in the proposed rules over that issue. And, you know, I want to emphasize with you and the public, we have made a lot of changes from where we started with the concepts in this program, and we'll continue to make changes. And frankly, when we get into public comment, I expect we're going to hear public comment that'll lead to further changes, and we'll probably get some direction from you all at a certain point in the development of this program to change certain things in this proposal. So this will continue to evolve, and we very much appreciate the thoughtful input from members of the Rules Advisory Committee and the public on this. And we hear the concern about CCI capacity to actually get that level of projects done. And so thinking about how to resource that and whether we've opened the door too far to use of CCIs, I think are legitimate issues that we're going to go back and look at more carefully. I think those are the main things that I wanted to touch on today. There were a couple of other, we didn't really get into the best available emissions reduction stuff very deeply yesterday, but I know there are some concerns in that area of the program as well. And we're continuing to look at that. A final area of concern on the climate protection program was around sequestration and whether there could be essentially offsets for sequestration and use of offsets to invest in working lands, particularly in tree planting on forest lands. And I think I have significant concerns about that. I think staff share those concerns. We don't really have time to get into it in detail here today. We are going to try to provide some material to the public that talks a little bit about why we are not currently recommending that a high priority be given to sequestration, that we instead prioritize getting our most vulnerable communities off of fossil fuels, natural gas, heating oil, gasoline, and diesel, so that those communities are not stuck holding the bag with old, very expensive infrastructure as we transition to a cleaner energy economy. But we'll say more about that in material that we put out along with the draft rules so that people can understand the reasoning behind some of what we're suggesting at this point. And with that, I think that's what I wanted to say about the climate protection program for now. Any questions about that from commissioners or comments?
No.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to shift to just walking you through some of the high points of the written director's report. The first section of the director's report addresses 5 rulemakings that are coming to the commission, that are scheduled to come to the commission in at the next 2 meetings, that being September and November. And there are some pretty significant rulemakings included in those 5. And the first one on the first page of the written director's report is the rulemaking on landfill methane emissions. Recall that that is part of the governor's executive order 20-04 on climate, is that we conform our rules on landfill methane emissions to essentially the most stringent rules that exist in our neighbors. Those rules essentially being California and Washington in particular. So that rulemaking is expected to come to the commission in September for a decision on those rules, and has been going on relatively quietly, but it is an important step as part of the overall effort in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The second rulemaking is with regard to Clean Air Oregon, and again, on the State of the Environment report earlier today, at the very end, you heard a little bit about the importance of the benchmarks and toxicity reference values, TRVs, and how they are used in our both Clean Air Oregon program and how they were used earlier in our air toxics program that actually predated Cleaner Air Oregon, that is focused more on area sources of toxic emissions. The purpose of this rulemaking is to align those 2 programs. The one focused more on area sources in Cleaner Air Oregon, which is focused on individual particular facilities and their air toxics emissions, so that we have consistency between the 2 programs. That rulemaking is scheduled to come before you in November of this year. It also does include some process improvements in the Cleaner Air Oregon program as well. The third rulemaking is on the advanced clean trucks and low NOx omnibus rules. This is adopting the California regulations that have been already adopted by the California Air Resources Board. You heard from quite a few people about the importance of these rules yesterday, both in terms of reducing conventional pollutants from our freight system, but also is part of the overall effort to reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions. And we heard a little bit yesterday that evidently at the Oregon Transportation Commission meeting earlier this month, there was some discussion about a delay. Nobody's talked to me about a delay in that rulemaking, and I have no, I'll tell you right now, I haven't heard any reasons for delaying this rulemaking. We have every intention of bringing that to the commission for your decision in November of this year. And you heard from some of the advocates yesterday why this is so important. There are a couple of other rulemakings with regard to water quality fees and the hazardous waste program. I'm not going to go into the details of those, but you've got those 5 rulemakings that are coming at you in the next 2 meetings. And then also recall that the climate protection program rules will be coming to you in December, immediately after those 2 meetings. So it is going to be a busy period here for the next several commission meetings on rulemaking. And it may not, some of these rules will be probably a bit more contentious. This won't be, I'm looking at Commissioner Kyle thinking of the fun OWEB meetings. This will not be as fun to be very direct. Okay.
Vice Chair Barrasso.
I'm always double muted. Okay. Thank you, Chair George. Richard, as it relates to the climate protection program, and I know that there's going to be a public comment session that is going to be held with the commission, and so we're certainly going to get to hear from folks on at least some of we're going to hear from folks on the rules, at least as once they're out. And it'd just be good to really think about, as we all hear, and I know public comment, typically we sit back and we listen, but is there, as part of that, just to think about, is there an opportunity, and I don't know how the days could be sequenced, for us to then also have an opportunity to reflect on that feedback and just talk about things that are coming up then before coming back in December and making a final decision. There's going to be another point that it's going to be worthwhile for all of us to, I know we can do smaller, 2-on-2 briefings and whatnot, so maybe that's the format, but I just wanted to, knowing that it's going to be busy, and that's a pretty big piece of work, and that folks will line up in that public comment. Well, I know I'll have questions, and I've got questions and they're being answered, but I'm just trying to think so I'm happy to think about that, and I know that people are busy, so.
Thank you, Vice Chair Barrasso and Chair George. We will think carefully about how to structure that. I kind of agree with you. I would prefer not to just see it be a one-way, have you get 2-minute sound bites from members of the public. It's not that that's not important, and people can be very articulate, as we heard yesterday, in a 2-minute period. But in order for it really to be helpful to you and to the department in crafting the best possible program for Oregon, having some back and forth and doing it in a little bit more of almost a workshop format. So we provide some opportunity for the public to comment, but then kind of workshop it a little bit with you. As long as we do that publicly, I don't think there's a legal problem with that. And so we'll talk with you about some options about how potentially to do that. And this would be at the September EQC meeting. And it probably would mean, we're gonna have to think about the time, because as you heard, there are a bunch of other things also coming to the September meeting. So that agenda is going to be challenging, and we'll do our best to accommodate all of that.
Well, I do appreciate the question and the answer. This is big work. This is very significant work, and we've all talked about it before. You know, folks share, like you say, very impassioned, very articulate concerns. And there are times that we'd like the opportunity to kind of wrestle with that ourselves and say, you know, well, what about this? Well, what about that? Could this possibly work? And have a little freedom and a little grace to have those kinds of exploratory conversations. So I appreciate you thinking about it. We also will appreciate that we have some very ambitious agendas coming up, but I appreciate you taking a look at it and seeing what we can do.
Great. Thank you, Chair George and Vice Chair. So more to come on that. But I think the public can anticipate that there will be an opportunity there, just for members of the public who are watching this now, there will be at least, well, there will be 2 public hearings. There will be, one of those will be structured so that there'll be time before the commission. The other one will be before a hearing officer. And so, and frankly, that's not completely, we're going to have at least 2. It's possible we might even have a third one, depending on work that we do here over the next couple of weeks to tie down the details of that. Okay, let's see, a few other things in the director's report, and I'm sorry, I'm just realizing we're over time here also, so I want to be responsible about that as well. So the laboratory just released an important report on wildfire smoke trends in Oregon, and it doesn't contain any surprises. It shows what you would expect, which is that we are getting a significantly greater number of unhealthy air days, both for sensitive populations and the general public, and you know, very directly attributed to wildfire smoke. There's been quite a bit of media attention on that report. It's been pretty widely reported. For the land quality division, just a note, you heard yesterday about the recycling modernization legislation that passed, but we also have important existing producer responsibility programs around drug take back and e-cycles that already were following this model of producers having part of the responsibility for recycling, responsible recycling of prescription drugs and electric computers and other electronics, and those and we also have a paint stewardship program. So the legislation that just passed takes our existing experience with extended producer responsibility and really extends it significantly. But Oregon really is a national leader in this area of extended producer responsibility. Very proud of the work that's going on there in the agency. In the region, oh, I'm sorry, one more thing, water quality. The work that's going on with the Oregon Department of Forestry around the Memorandum of Understanding on TMDL implementation. So this came up briefly yesterday, but just to give you a quick update on where things are, staff of the 2 agencies are continuing to meet to work through a draft of the MOU. We do have a working draft. It is getting there. It is still needs a bit of work, but we have another meeting, several more meetings of staff, and then a meeting between the Board of Forestry Chair and Chair George, Commissioner Mosby, Jim Justice from the Board of Forestry, also to look at the draft one more time before we release it in late August for a public comment period. So we are still on track for that. We will have plan to have a 30-day public comment period, and then we will bring it back, probably make some more revisions, and then bring it back to you and to the Board of Forestry at a portion of your November meeting, which will be a joint opportunity for meeting along with the Board of Forestry. As currently set up. The MOU is not signed. This, unlike the MOU that we considered yesterday, that is has to be approved by the Environmental Quality Commission. The MOU between DEQ and forestry does not technically get approved by the EQC. That said, I'm going to listen very carefully to my commissioners to hear where you're at on the MOU before we make any final decisions on the MOU. And you know, the work continues. The current draft is pretty detailed in terms of very particular steps. And I think we want it to be more detailed. We want it to be very transparent in terms of how things are going to get done and decided, and how we are going to be more efficient in developing and implementing TMDLs and what the role of each agency is. To be maybe very direct on this, and you'll be and everybody will be hearing more about this, but again, following from the advice from the Oregon Department of Justice in March of this year, we will, as part of the TMDLs that we are developing here in the coming years, we will be expressly deciding whether or not existing generally applicable Oregon forest practice rules are sufficient or are adequate or not adequate for achieving load allocations in TMDLs. And I apologize for the jargon, but in English, what that means is when we are doing a TMDL, it means we are in a situation where we are not meeting water quality standards. And the load allocations specify what needs to be done to actually get in compliance with water quality standards. How do we have to improve conditions in our rivers and streams to meet a temperature standard or another standard? So those load allocations, we will be looking at those and making an express determination about whether existing generally applicable Forest Practice Act rules are or are not adequate to meet those load allocations. And if they are not, then the two agencies will need to work together to figure out what additional measures need to be taken in each area in order to come into compliance with water quality standards. And that may mean rulemaking for the Board of Forestry, or it may mean other things. And that's part of what the MOU will lay out also.
Well, I have to say that I'm glad to hear it. And I know that there are folks who may be challenged by that. But I kind of made reference yesterday morning that you know, Commissioner Mosby and I think we're really very frank with everybody, our friends around that table, as we started those discussions, to say, you know, the reason we're here and the reason we want to spend our own time really engaging deeply on this is because we have a system right now that just we're not getting from here to there, and we're not seeing implementation on the ground. And we don't think that's an efficient use of our agency's time or our agency's resources. And frankly, we're quite certain our rivers don't have the luxury of waiting any longer. So Richard, when you talk about that level of detail, that to me is very hopeful, and that is worth a pause. I did want to make note that I think the director's report said a draft outline of the new MOU was presented to the board and the EQC at their joint meeting in March. I don't think we've seen a draft. Am I wrong?
Chair George, it's a draft of the outline. You have not seen a draft of the actual MOU.
Yes. So yeah, I agree. I agree with that. And that's where the information, the meaningful information is. So I think this is critically important. This is an opportunity to fix something that just simply hasn't worked for far too long. Again, it's important to recognize that it's not only our friends in forestry who we need to really dig deep with, but they're the folks at the table with us right now, and I'm tremendously grateful for that. And I think we can really do something to be more efficient with our state resources and with what we need to do for our rivers. And so I want staff to push hard on this because I want our investment of time and effort to really pay off. One thing I want to mention, which we have not discussed in the context of this MOU, but we are hearing more and more about all the time from more and more people. And that, and I'm sure folks on this call have heard from folks as well, is communities whose drinking water depends upon forested watersheds, and some of those in private, or at least to a large degree in private forestry hands. And this is another really tough problem, and it is not going to be solved here, but it's certainly something we heard about yesterday. It's something we're hearing about more and more. And again, I would request that at some point we take an opportunity to talk about how is it that these communities who rely on these forested watersheds for safe drinking water, how is it that we can, I don't know, maybe do a similar problem solving exercise, but help folks or prompt folks to work together. So I just didn't want to leave our forestry topics today without noting that. Others? Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Chair George. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to mention a couple of other things and then wrap up the director's report for today so that we don't keep you too much over. The rest of the report deals with our three regions for DEQ. So in the Eastern region, a couple of things of note. In the Klamath Basin, we have obviously the terrible fire going on right now, the bootleg fire, but we also have a terrible drought situation, and that is affecting everyone in the basin, including upriver and downriver tribes, as well as farmers, as well as communities. And you know, we are seeing in particular something that we have not seen to this extent before, which is impacts to drinking water wells for individual households. So we have over 100 drinking water wells that have gone dry in the Klamath Basin here in the Oregon portion of the Klamath Basin here in the last month or so. And some of that is because of the drought and lack of irrigation delivery. Some of it is from groundwater pumping by irrigators who are using wells, irrigation wells, to irrigate fields. So Oregon Emergency Response, Oregon, other Oregon agencies are working with Klamath County in responding to those situations. The state just ordered over 300 500-gallon drinking water containers to provide drinking water source for households in the Klamath. So there's a lot of work going on in that area right now, just around human health and keeping people with potable water. In the Northwest region, I think the main thing that I'm going to mention is we've got some significant work going on with Owens Brockaway, in particular the glass facility in northeast Portland, with a significant enforcement action right now that likely is going to end up requiring that facility to either install controls or commit to permanent changes in its operation to assure we're protecting health in that area. We also are working with Zenith, the petroleum transfer operation in Northwest Portland, around land use issues with the city of Portland that we'll be coming to a decision on here in the near future as well. In the Western region, we've already talked about Riverbend, but just to note that Also, Pembina formally withdrew the applications to the federal government for the Jordan Cove facility and associated pipeline. And so at least for now, because nothing is ever final, that project appears to be no longer on the books in terms of a proposal. So I think with that, I will conclude the director's report for this meeting unless there are any questions from commissioners.
Commissioners, do you have any other questions or comments, either on the things that Richard selected to highlight or what was in the written report? All right, looks like none. Again, before we conclude the public portion of our meeting, we want to thank everybody who's been a part of it. A lot of work got done in the last day and a half, and a lot of work goes into every single item that ends up on our agenda long before it comes to this table or this Zoom platform. So thank you again, everyone. We are going to shortly adjourn the public portion of this meeting. We do have a noticed executive session after this, and there is a separate link that we will be rejoining for the executive session. Director, anyone else, anything else for our public session before we conclude? No, okay. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn the public portion of this EQC meeting.
Commissioner Kyle, so moved.
Second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Does anybody object to adjourning? Hearing none, we are adjourned at 10:20. Stephanie, when you are ready, please go ahead and conclude the recorded portion of our meeting.
And thank you, Chair George. This is Stephanie Caldera, your commission assistant. One note for the people on the line, the executive session will maintain on this link. I will close the recording. We will take a short break, but I do ask that the participants in the executive session remain on this line. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie, for catching my mistake there. I had just seen a link in our emails and I made a bit of an assumption. So thanks for that clarification. Again, best to everyone.